Sir, you're charged with especially aggravated kidnapping. You're also charged with aggravated assault.
Wow, that's crazy. Hang on, let me fix it. Sorry, I'm a bit frazzled. The police are on their way, so hang on one second. Let's just scratch all that and do it all over again. Is that cool? You guys ready? We're going to go back and pretend none of this happened.
Sir, you're charged with especially aggravated kidnapping. You're also charged with aggravated assault. And you're charged with theft of a firearm worth less than $2,500.
You're talking about stuff that is not relevant.
Hello and welcome to the Court of Public Opinion. I am the Recovery Addict, and boy, do I have a case for you today.
Why is the dog chewing on this guy?
I think they have got the wrong guy there.
They got the wrong guy, and the dog was biting him.
He roughing him up quite a bit. There's a lawsuit.
This is the next search on February 28, 2020, 7:44 p.m. How does the FBI find people, and people misspelled P-E-O-O-P-L-E?
I object.
Did the defendant find out how the FBI finds people in this case? Oh, she found out.
All right. Welcome back to the Court of Public Opinion. Never a dull moment. Never a dull moment in the RA household. It was my neighbor. No. It wasn't my neighbor. It was a relative of a distant neighbor. So yeah. So now I get to file a police report. I'm not a hard guy to work with, but so help me, my house, that's my castle. We can be friends outside, but if you come in without my permission, I hope you made peace beforehand, because that's not cool. That's not cool. Apparently the water crew was as astounded as I was while they stood by and just watched him enter our house without permission. So yeah, I need to... And he's like, "Oh yeah, my sister lives down the road over there." So I had the only thing I had with me was my goat. Literally, I carried this out when I went there. And I've had 2 calls now. Police are on their way. I'm going to just file a little report. The city was there. The city told the neighbor what they wanted to do. So the neighbor then did it as they stood by and watched. Here's let me give you the full scoop. I know we're missing court, but it'll catch up. Here's a full scoop. My house has a basement. Guess what? I live in North Carolina, eastern North Carolina, where the water table is about 2 inches below the ground level. Okay. My basement is 3 feet below ground level. We have a sump pump. It just snowed a couple weeks ago. It's been melting. The ice has been melting. It's still melting in the shade. The sump pump collects the water from where the snow melts in the bottom of the steps, which is lower than my basement. So the water doesn't go into my basement. Sometimes the sump float gets stuck and it builds up a little bit and then it triggers and it pumps out a lot of water and it pumps it out to the street because it's not house water. It's not sewer water. It goes just out to the street. The city crew wants to know why there's water on the street when it's not raining. And so they want to see if there's a leak. Well, they look along the pipe and they see, oh, there's water. It comes out of this pipe right here. That should be done. It's a sump. All right, we're good. No, they go one extra step and want to figure out if it's actually my sump or not, if there's a leak in my house. Well, you can tell if there's a leak in my house by looking at the meter, because if the meter's not spinning because it has a leak detector, I don't have a leak. I know this because I had a leak years ago. We used over 46,000 gallons of water in 1 month, thousands and thousands of dollars for a water bill. I replaced all my lines, all the way out to the main. Everything is brand new, no leaks. So they don't come to my door. They just, the neighbor, the family member of a distant neighbor says, "Hey, what are you guys doing on the street?" "Oh, we're trying to figure out where the water's coming from." "It's probably a sump." And he comes around and he opens up my basement, and not just down to the steps, but then he opens the basement to get in the house. That's breaking and entering. I'm sorry. You can't do that. So, all right. It's literally underneath where I sit. Like, they were 8 feet from me. I could hear them yelling. You saw me get up and leave in the middle of the goat video. But so I kicked them off my property. I'm like, why do you care if I have a leak or not? First of all, because you can check and tell right at the meter, and I don't have a leak, and you're fine. But okay, let's start court. And I'm going to have to get up and walk away because the police are on their way, and I'd like to file a report. So, all right.
Conclusion is that the pathway is. Oh, I think I understand now.
Back up. I missed just a couple questions. Wait for it. Okay, here we go. All right. Yeah, they would be perforated if it was just Mrs. R.A. She wouldn't stand for that. She would be much
we'll
more
go back
shoot
on the
first,
record.
ask questions later.
Doctor, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson, are you ready to pick back up with your direct?
I am, thank you, Your Honor. And I think there was the parties had conferred about a demonstrative exhibit right before the break, and I think we've resolved that issue.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right. Dr. Hammers, before we broke for lunch, you were starting to talk about some of the hypotheses that you tested in this case. Before we get to that, I want to go back to one thing that we discussed earlier in your testimony, which is the groupings of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back, wounds A through F that we were discussing earlier. And I'm going to show you an exhibit that we looked at earlier, which shows the wounds and the measurements. Do you have that exhibit in front of you?
Not quite yet.
Okay, thank you. It's
Okay. This one?
it's the one with the measurements on it.
Oh, never mind. Okay.
What's that?
I got you.
Do you have the phone in front of you?
I do
Dr.
now.
Hammers. Now, in your review of Dr. Cruz's materials from the autopsy, did she document the trajectory that these wounds took within Ms. Mullis's body?
She did.
And going through the wounds from A to F, can you tell us what those trajectories were?
Sure. So wound A was from the back of the body toward the front, from the right of the body to the left, and slightly downward.
What about wound B?
B was the same, right to left, forward and slightly downward.
What about C?
It was also the same, front to back, right to left and slightly downward.
And D?
And that was the same, front to back, or back to front, back to front, right to left and slightly downward.
What about E?
E was back to front, right to left, and sharply upward.
And what about F?
Back to front, right to left, and sharply upward.
Were you able to determine from Dr. Cruz's documentation the specific path that any of these wounds took through Ms. Mullis's chest?
So she did document like rib spaces that they went through, and the injuries with A and B, she documented specifically the organs that they struck.
Does documentation of the rib spaces help you determine with some specificity the path that certain wounds took through her chest?
Yes, it gives you either an ending point or a point along the way that you can tell if it's going slightly downward, upward, or sharply upward or downward.
Is there something with people's rib cages called an intercostal space?
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Yes, so you have 12 ribs, and in between your ribs, that's called the intercostal space. And so you have your first rib and then your second rib, and your first intercostal space is between the first and second rib, and so on as you go down the rib cage.
And every person has 12 ribs?
Yes, in general, yes.
So for everyone, though, the numbering of those intercostal spaces is the same?
Correct. It's the same. It's always the space below it is the number of the rib above it.
And so for which of these wounds were you able to determine, because of the other things in Ms. Mullis's body that they passed through, what their more precise path was?
So A and B went through rib spaces, and E and F went through rib spaces. C and D only went into the soft tissue and muscle of the back.
I'm going to show you another demonstrative, which we conferred with the state about before the break. This is purely a demonstrative exhibit, Your Honor. It's not being offered into evidence. We've referred to it as demonstrative A. Do you see the demonstrative in front of you?
I do.
Would using demonstrative A assist you in describing your testimony, Dr. Hammers?
Yes.
What is depicted in demonstrative A?
So demonstrative A has the wounds A through F. It is a look at from the side of the body. So looking basically like from the right to the left side. So it's two-dimensional, but it has all the wounds A through F. It has their relative location on the body, and then the direction with an arrow that the pathway travels based off of the locations that Dr. Cruz had documented in her autopsy report.
And does Figure A depict the trajectories and the relative depths of wounds A through F based on your understanding of Dr. Cruz's documentation?
Yes, it does.
Did any of the information that's depicted in the demonstrative in front of you, the trajectories, the relative depths, the directions of the wounds, did that assist you in your understanding of which wounds you consider to be grouped together in some way?
I would say yes.
And how?
So it allowed me to understand that A through D had a similar, essentially a similar pathway in the body, and that E and F had a very different and distinct pathway in the body. It also explained and confirmed my suspicion about wounds A and B being caused from the tine staying in the body and being much deeper than wound C, and also confirmed that wound D, where it did not come out of the clothing, it also only went into the body a very shallow depth.
Now, from what you told us before the break, it's your opinion that Ms. Mullis experienced wound D at a different time from A, B, and C. Is that right?
Well, different from, I guess, the grouping of A, B, and C, but what I've testified to is that from my review, A and B did not leave the body, so then C would have been at a different time than D, essentially. And
is your understanding of the trajectories of these wounds, is that inconsistent with your understanding of, is anything about the trajectories of these wounds inconsistent with your opinions about when and in what order Ms. Mullis experienced these wounds?
No.
All right. In thinking about the trajectories of these wounds, what were the trajectories of wounds A through F relative to Ms. Mullis's body?
What do you mean by that?
Well, if we think of and I understand that we're not talking in terms of the actual position that Ms. Mullis's body was in when she experienced these injuries, whether she's laying down or standing up. I'm not asking you about that, but treating her body as a vertical object. Where were the wounds relative in terms of the trajectory? What was the trajectory relative to her body?
I'm still not 100% sure that I understand what you mean. Or I don't know, are you asking about the anatomic position and how we measure them, or are you asking about something else?
I appreciate that question. If we treat the axis of the body as a vertical axis, how would you describe the trajectory of these wounds relative to that axis?
Oh, I think I understand now. Okay, so they're all going from the back of the body toward the front. They are all going from the right side of the body toward the left, and then A through D are going slightly downward, and E and F are toward her feet, essentially, but only very slightly. And then E and F are going up toward her head.
And those wounds A to C, when you say they're going slightly downward, are those near horizontal?
Very close to horizontal, yes.
Okay.
That would be a symbol. That would be significant for where the...
I think we were starting to talk about your hypotheses in this case, and I think the hypothesis that you were discussing before we broke was the hypothesis that someone swung this corn rake into Miss Mullis's back. And I apologize because I don't remember. Did you tell us what your conclusion was about this hypothesis?
I honestly don't remember.
Well, what was your hypothesis? What was your hypothesis, or what was your conclusion about the hypothesis that Miss Mullis experienced these wounds in her back from someone swinging the corn rake into her back?
So my conclusion is that the pathway is not consistent with the features of the corn rake and the space within the shed to be able to cause this set of injuries in these pathways.
So leaving the position of the shed out of your analysis for a minute, were you able to determine, without knowing anything about the shed on the Mullis farm, whether this hypothesis was true or not?
The swinging hypothesis? Well, with swinging, that can't describe, if you sort of have swinging in any sort of way, shape, or form, it can't describe the entire set of injuries that have occurred.
Why not?
Because there's 4 tines to the rake, there's 6 injuries plus the scrape to her back, and they are in different directions.
Is it possible or were you able to disprove the hypothesis that someone caused these injuries in Miss Mullis's back by someone swinging the rake into her back more than once?
I was.
And what's your determination about that hypothesis?
That is not true because the clothing does not support that.
How does the clothing not support that?
So the outer coat of the clothing has even fewer holes than what we saw on the inner clothing, indicating that at least some of the tines of the rake did not exit the clothing in total at all.
Now, is it your testimony that the physical characteristics of the shed on the Mullis property contributed to your determination that someone could not have swung this rake into Miss Mullis's back to cause these injuries?
Yes, that's part of it.
And you said that you visited the shed on the property, is that right?
I did.
What was it about the shed on the property that contributed to your opinions that this is not possible?
So the openings in the shed are very narrow and leave little room to either side in order to swing a rake. And that would mean swinging from overhead would be necessary, and that does not add up with the direction of the wounds and the number of the wounds.
I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked. I'm going to show you an exhibit that's been marked as 731.
I think she needs to explain that further.
Do you recognize what is depicted in Exhibit 731?
Yes.
What is it?
This is one of the walkways in the shed.
Does Exhibit 731 truly and accurately depict the interior of the Mullis shed at the time that you visited it?
To the best of my recollection, yes, it does.
All right. We'll seek to admit Exhibit 731, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No objection.
731 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
There are more holes in the shirt than in the coat. Is that what I heard?
Do you have any understanding of where in this shed Ms. Mullis might have? Let me ask you a better question. What the hypotheses that you were considering about Ms. Mullis having someone swing the rake into her back in this shed? What areas of the shed did you consider in that hypothesis?
So basically the only open areas of the shed where you could walk, which were all very narrow within the shed. And then there was an area in the shed where it was reported that she was going to get a carrier, and that was in an area in one of those narrow walkways.
From your review of photographs and descriptions of this shed, and from your own visit to the shed, did you determine any area inside of the shed that would allow for the hypothesis that someone swung a corn rake into Miss Mullis's back in that area of the shed?
I did not.
Did you test a hypothesis that Ms. Mullis received wounds A through F from someone pushing the corn rake into her back?
I did consider that, yes.
And what was your conclusion about that hypothesis?
So my conclusion was, from my experience and training, I've not seen any kind of injuries like that with having multiple tines of any type of object able to push into somebody, and comparing that to other cases that I have, which have not been from a corn rake but from different weapons, that not being ever reported to me, ever seen by me, or anything that I've witnessed any of my colleagues having, where someone has been able to push an object like that through somebody's clothes and into their body one time, let alone multiple times.
Did you test a hypothesis that Ms. Mullis received these injuries by falling onto this corn rake one or more times?
Yes.
And what did you determine about that hypothesis?
So from considering that hypothesis, based off of all of the information that I reviewed, that was the most likely and reasonable hypothesis, given the location, the distribution of the injuries, the features of the injuries, the features of the corn rake, and my experience and training.
We agree that if Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries by falling, she had to have fallen on this corn rake more than once. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Why does the hypothesis that she fell on this corn rake fit with the evidence as you understand it?
So the fact that it appears that she received wounds A, B, and C clustered together, and that wound D is in a similar area to C but is much more shallow, and there's movement of wounds A and B, and all of those injuries are in a similar distribution, I would expect that there could be more shallow injuries from her falling, even potentially from different heights or different distances above the ground. And then the change in that orientation with wounds, tines A and B staying inside those wounds, and then her sustaining the other two injuries. So to me, when I look at all the features of the wounds consistent with coming from the same object, and then the similarities in their orientation, that to me is the most likely and reasonable scenario for how those injuries occurred. And it fits with the differences of the features that I saw inside and outside of the body with wounds A and B.
Did you get any information from Ms. Mullis's medical history about prescription medications that she was taking around the time of her death?
Yes.
From the medical records, what were you able to determine about that?
So she had 5 medications that were listed as her current medications. 3 of them were medications that can sort of have a similar effect on the body, and in my training and experience were the more significant of the 3 medications that she was on that were listed in her medical record. 2 of them appeared to be medication she was on typically, and then 1 of them was a medication she was given post-operatively after her procedure.
And what would have been the consequences of those medications?
So those medications all can have similar effects of dizziness, somnolence, meaning sleepiness, and kind of like, those are like the 2 main, dizziness and tiredness.
Did the toxicology report that accompanied the autopsy in this case reveal those medications?
Can you ask me that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. Did the toxicology report that was conducted as part of Dr. Cruz's autopsy in this case, did it reveal those medications?
It did not.
And is there a reason why?
So the toxicology panel that was tested for does not include those medications in what is tested for. So you have to have a panel of medications that you're testing for, and you're only going to potentially get positive results from the medications that are being looked for.
What is the generally accepted practice in the field of forensic pathology with respect to autopsies for seeking more than a basic toxicology panel in a case?
So the recommendation from the National Association of Medical Examiners is that you know the medication somebody is potentially taking, weigh them in your evaluation, and order testing that is appropriate for the information that you have.
And in this situation, given the information that was available with respect to the autopsy, was this a situation that where a generally accepted practice would be to seek more than a basic panel for the toxicology testing?
So in my training and experience, yes, this panel is, in my experience and using this same lab, so I'm familiar with the panel, is a limited panel and misses medications that a very high number of the population actually take routinely. So it's really looking for substances of abuse or medications that are commonly abused.
You talked earlier before the break and in your testimony just now about seeking contextual information as part of your determinations, seeking information about medical history and the area where someone's injuries might have occurred, and looking at investigative records. Is there any concern for you as a forensic pathologist that contextual information could bias you in some way to information that you're seeing at autopsy?
I would say no. Our job and the recommendation of all of our national organizations is that the job of the forensic pathologist is to be trained and have experience to weigh all of those items and balance out what is in them with what we have at autopsy, and to ultimately make a decision about cause and manner of death. So that's the whole reason that we're trained, is to gather that information, assess it, and form opinions.
Do you need that contextual information in certain cases to reach your determinations?
I would say that we need it in the vast majority of cases, but certainly cases that are more complicated, but we never know sort of how a case is going to turn out and the complexities that will come with it. So best practices are to have the information that's available through the steps that we described, if it's available and accessible.
Did you reach an opinion in this case, Dr. Hammers, about how you would classify the manner of Ms. Mullis's death?
I did.
And what is your conclusion after consideration of all of the background evidence and the evaluation of the hypotheses that you considered in this case?
My opinion is that the manner of death is best classified as an accident.
Why is that?
All of the information that I had available to me to review, it fits with the injuries that were seen. It makes logical sense. There was, witness statements, there was medical information that all came together to add up to what was seen on the body. So there wasn't anything about the injuries and how Ms. Mullis was described as being found or the implement that was found in her, the way it was reported, the way her body was reported, that made this inconsistent with anything but an accident. I'm sorry, consistent with anything but an accident. I apologize.
Oops, I said the wrong part.
A forensic pathologist to determine that the manner of death in a case is a homicide. What is the generally accepted practice in forensic pathology about the level of proof that a forensic pathologist needs to have to make that determination?
So typically we use to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, but another way to say that would be that it's far more likely than not. So it's not just 51% that this is a homicide, it's that all of the information that you have far outweighs this being a homicide than anything else.
Is your determination that that the manner of Ms. Mullis's death was an accident, is that dependent on an understanding that her death must have occurred in the shed?
I would say no. It's not dependent on that, although I haven't seen any information that indicates that this occurred at any other location.
Is there a process as a medical examiner for a medical examiner to reconsider the official cause of death that they identified in a death certificate or in other documentation about a case?
Yes.
What is that process?
So it's there's no sort of formal name for it, but basically any case that you have, someone can always come and ask you to reconsider it. The death certificate is always subject to being able to be changed with new information that changes your cause or manner of death. And so anytime somebody poses new information, you can take that information, review the case in light of that new information, and then decide if you will or will not change the death certificate.
Are there any situations in your career where someone has come to you with new information about a case where you've made an official determination about cause or manner of death?
Yes, there have been.
And under generally accepted practices in forensic pathology, what should the response of a forensic pathologist be in that situation?
Well, in every case that I've had or other people have had where I've worked, the information that comes is taken seriously. It's reviewed. Typically, it's reviewed with someone who is a superior to you. So I would review it, then I would sit down with my boss and discuss it, and we would come to an understanding of, what that how that material that was new weighed into what we already had, and if that changed the ultimate opinions or not.
Are you familiar with a concept called implicit bias?
Yes.
What is that?
I'm going to object. It's outside the scope of this witness's knowledge.
I agree. Sustained.
Do you understand? Are you familiar with a field of science called biomechanical engineering?
Yes.
And in general terms, what's your understanding of what that field is?
Again, I'm going to object. Same objection.
Did you want to respond?
I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt the court. This is in Dr. Hammers' report that she considered this field and that she consulted with an expert in this field in reaching her opinions. I don't intend to go into the details of this field. That's not my purpose, but just that's the purpose for these questions, Your Honor.
I believe they have a biomechanical expert that is the next witness. I don't know why we have to rehash this. It's outside our scope.
very, very
limited.
Let's keep it very, very limited.
Understood, Your Honor.
Thank you, my friend.
Very limited. And again,
Appreciate you.
I'll read the report. This isn't a jury trial. Let's try to move this along, please, Ms. Thompson.
Understood, Your Honor.
The judge is saying, I'm smart enough you can go faster than we're going.
Let me ask you this question, Dr. Hammers. Do forensic scientists consult in some cases with biomechanical experts in reaching their opinions?
Yes.
Is that a generally accepted practice in your field?
Yes, it is.
Did you consult with a biomechanical expert in considering your opinions in this case?
I certainly read their report, but I had my own opinions separate from what the biomechanical expert had to say. It happened that their opinion supported what I already believed to be the case, which was this was an accident. But my opinions and my conclusions were made outside of that.
The opinions that you've offered in your testimony here today, are any of those opinions based on new developments in the field of forensic pathology since 2019?
No.
Are these opinions that you could have offered in 2019?
Yes.
Just one moment, Your Honor.
So that means there was a mistake by the previous lawyers to not do this.
Is the report that you referenced reading in the field of biomechanical engineering in this case a report from someone named Dr. Susan Boley?
Yes.
And did you consider the information in Dr. Boley's opinion, the report that you read in reaching your opinions in this case?
I did consider it, yes.
Your Honor, on that basis, we are seeking to admit Dr. Boley's report in this case, and I think that we could take up the issue of its admissibility at another time, but we are at this point making a proffer that we'd seek to admit it based on this testimony.
And for the reasons we've already stated early on in testimony earlier this morning, we have the same objection to that based upon the same cases that I cited.
Okay.
Here comes
Sure.
the spiciness.
And we'll save that argument for another time so we can keep moving forward.
Put a pin in it, says
I have no
the
other
judge.
questions this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Here we go.
Dr. Hammers, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. You agree the wounds that caused Amy Mullis's death, as they've been described by Kelly Cruz, you agree with that, correct?
That the set of puncture wounds caused her death?
Right.
Yes, that's correct.
And there were other injuries to her body that were observed at autopsy, these blunt force injuries that you've described?
Yes, there were blunt force injuries, correct.
So you agree with Cruz on what she calls them sharp force injuries, you call them something else, but it's the stab wounds that caused her death, correct?
I wouldn't call them stab wounds, but the penetrating wounds, yes.
So penetrating wounds, as observed at autopsy, you agree with Dr. Cruz that those caused Amy Mullis's death, correct?
They caused her death, correct.
And the number of injuries Kelly Cruz counted correctly, would that be true?
A through F, yes.
Okay, and you agree that A through F are the injuries that were observed at autopsy?
Correct.
You don't have any contrary information or anything that you observed from the autopsy of Kelly Cruz that would contradict that, correct?
In regard to the number of injuries, if we're just talking to the ones on her back, yes, I agree with that.
That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
You agree with Cruz on the orientation of the injuries on the back, correct?
Yes.
You don't have any dispute with the measurements that she made with regard to the distance between the injuries, correct?
Correct. I'm not disagreeing with her measurements.
Or the depth of the injuries?
I'm not disagreeing with her depth measurements. 4
of the injuries, A through D, were downward, and the other 2, E and F, were upward?
Correct.
Okay. And I think I asked you this already about all the blunt force injuries. You agree those were all documented correctly. Is that right?
As far as I would say the location and the general description.
And the photographs that you were able to observe.
Yes.
I think the only thing maybe were critical of Dr. Cruz on was that she should have taken more photos of the internal injuries. Is that true?
I mean, if we're just talking about the autopsy process, I would say yes, she could have taken more internal photographs.
So what it really boils down to is your disagreement with Dr. Cruz is that she ruled this a homicide and you would have ruled it an accident, right? Is that what this really comes down to?
I mean, I would say that's the final statement, but I think there's other things in between that I don't agree with the way that she's described them or testified to them.
You may have done the autopsy differently, correct? You may have done different things if you would have done the autopsy to Amy Mullis.
True, maybe.
And that differs from pathologist to pathologist, isn't that true?
I mean, yes, there's going to be some variation.
Right. I mean, the core of what you do is basically the same, but there may be some variations there, correct?
True.
All right. Now, I know that you discussed these hypotheses here, but swinging the rake could cause the injuries that we see on her back, correct?
I don't know that they could, actually.
Not at all? Can completely exclude it?
I believe that I testified that I did exclude that as a possibility.
Okay. You could push the rake into Amy Mullis's back, correct?
I believe I disagreed with that as well.
Okay.
How did it get there?
So an attacker, let's assume there's an attacker, okay, that's not an accident. They could take the rake and use it as a weapon and push it into Amy Mullis's back, right? They could do that.
I believe I just testified just a little while ago that I've never seen that, I've never read that, and I've never read any report of somebody pushing a corn rake into somebody's back.
I'm not sure there is another murder with a corn rake out there.
Objection.
Would you agree?
Your objection is?
I apologize. I'm not trying to get animated, Your Honor, but that really assumes, obviously, the exact issue that we're here to talk about, whether there's another murder with a corn rake. Because the issue here is whether this was a murder, Your Honor. That's why we're here.
Okay, well. Kelly, can you read me the question again?
She wasn't paying attention. She never does. I'm sorry.
I'm not sure that there is another murder with a corn rake out there. Would you agree?
Mr. Brown, I guess, maybe can you just ask a new question?
So I will. So I think we both can agree that the death by corn rake is something unique. Would that be true?
I would say it's unique in the specific implement, but there certainly have been cases of people dying with other farming type of implements that are in the category of a rake.
Or other instruments that are sharp enough to penetrate the body, correct?
Yes.
You see that all the time.
I wouldn't say all the time, but we see it.
But like a knife wound.
Enough.
Right?
Right, but this is very different than a knife wound.
I understand, but it's something that penetrates the body that causes death. You have seen that before.
Yes, correct.
Okay. We can both agree that the corn rake, specifically as an implement to do that, is unique. True?
Yes, that's true.
There are 6 injuries to the back of Amy Mullis that are penetrating injuries, correct?
Yes.
4 times on the corn rake.
Yes.
That means it penetrated her body more than 1 time, correct?
Yes.
All right. There has been a suggestion by Dr. Cruz that it was 2, very likely 3 times, and I assume you would agree with that.
The only thing that I would say is I think there had to be more than 1 episode of her being penetrated, but that doesn't imply that it was like that there was no contact with the body or no times in the body when those additional penetrations occurred.
All right, so there's 4 times on the corn rake, correct?
Yes.
We have 4 wounds that are in the same orientation in that you're nodding, so you agree with me, correct?
No.
No?
They're in the same direction, but they do not have the same orientation on the surface of the skin.
Okay, my apologies. But they're in the same direction, correct? And there are 4 of those, A, B, C, and D?
The path through the body is the same, yes, or similar.
And then there are 2 others that you have identified that would have happened at a different time, correct?
I don't know that I would say a different time, but
How would you say it? How did you say it?
they're traveling in a different direction, so they likely happened together, but I wouldn't specify the time.
All right. So you've classified this as an accident in your opinion, correct?
Yes.
So that means that the corn rake would have to be in a position where Amy Mullis could fall on it, correct?
Correct.
So it would have to be laying presumably on the ground, right?
I don't know that I would draw that conclusion because I'm not a biomechanical engineer, so I can't speak to the exact forces, but she would have to have enough acceleration of her body to generate enough force for that to pierce her clothing and her body.
Putting the rake on the ground, that would probably be the place furthest away from her where enough force could be generated to cause the injuries that you see, correct?
So again, I think it's very plausible that the rake could be on the ground, but I can't speak to the specific forces that it would take because I haven't done those calculations and don't have that expertise.
She would have to lose consciousness or strength, right, in order to fall. Would that be right?
She would have to do what?
She'd have to pass out.
In order to fall?
Correct.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sound alarmed. I'm sorry. No, I mean, you can trip and fall. You could step on equipment and fall. I don't think that consciousness is inferred from her falling.
But it would have to be with enough force that the tines of the rake could penetrate her body, correct?
Correct.
And that this happened multiple times, correct?
Some of the tines had to have penetrated her body more than one time.
So she fell on the rake more than once?
Correct.
Fell on it more than twice, very likely, correct?
Based off of what I've described, I think it's likely that it is more than twice.
Fell on it 3 times. That's a stretch, though.
You provided some testimony as to the location of this incident, and I believe you called it, you correct me if I'm wrong, some sort of barn or outbuilding?
I think I called it a shed.
A shed, okay. So are you presuming that Amy Mullis was killed in the shed?
I'm not presuming that she was killed, number one, because I told you that my opinion is it's an accident. But number two, I haven't seen any information that suggests or indicates that this happened anywhere but in the shed.
Who provided the information that it would have happened in the shed?
Well, the information that I've reviewed has no information that this likely happened anywhere else. There's blood droplets in the shed.
I'm asking you who provided it. Who provided the information? Todd Mullis, right? He's the one that provided the information that she was in the shed? Isn't that right?
That is not what my opinion is. If I can complete my answer, then I can explain to you where I got the information from. Okay. So, yes, there is statements from Mr. Mullis and his son about finding her in the shed. There are pictures from the deputies that went to the shed where there are blood droplets in the shed. There's no blood droplets anywhere else that are identified, and nobody, even the police reports that I read, indicated that they suspected that this happened anywhere else.
So Todd Mullis removed Amy Mullis from the scene, correct? You know that.
My understanding is that he and his son did.
And they would have put her in a car or vehicle, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Traveled for a distance?
That's my understanding, yes.
Pulled over because he was told to do so by EMTs, is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
So the ambulance and whoever was sent out to help her could meet on the roadside to assist, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
So there's no 911 call that happens from the farm. You never reviewed that, correct?
My understanding is that it happened like on the way to the toward the hospital.
Right, en route to the hospital, correct? Or
Correct.
en route to wherever he was taking it?
Correct.
To get back to the information that you're relying on that came from Todd Mullis, he provided information as to Amy Mullis being in the barn or the shed, correct?
So I just want to be clear. Are you saying that Mr. Mullis gave me materials to review?
No.
Is that what you're asking me?
Well, you told us that you reviewed the investigation in this case, right? And that he provided statements?
Okay, that's what I just want to be clear on. So what you're asking me is his statements to the police or to the hospital or to first
right, or wherever
responders,
they were, whatever source.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So how would you answer that question?
I'm sorry, what are you asking me about
I
that?
said the only person that provided information as to where Amy Mullis was located was Todd Mullis and possibly Tristan, correct? They're the only other two that were at the farm.
That's my understanding, yes.
Right. So only those two people. So there's no independent confirmation of that by law enforcement or anybody else that you know of, correct?
As far as specifically finding her the way that they did, it was the two of them, correct?
Right. And his description of Amy Mullis being in the barn with the rake in her back, that is his and his alone, correct?
I believe his son also stated that.
Okay, those two, but nobody else?
That's my understanding, yes.
The lawyer next to Todd is
Did you
typing.
factor into any of your opinions any information that Amy Mullis was unsteady on the day that she died?
I mean, I would say that I factored in the complaints that she had that were reported and the medications that she had and the complaints she had prior to her procedure and the fact that she had a procedure just about 4 days before that.
So what's the answer to that? That she was unsteady or that you had information that she was?
I'm saying I took all of that into consideration.
Okay. Todd Mullis also describes her that way, is that right?
I believe he described her as just coming back to helping on the farm that day because she had been staying, not working because of her procedure, and that she had complained about not feeling well in some way and was going back inside to rest.
Okay. So with regard to the amount of force that it would be needed to observe the injuries that you saw or that you also observed from Cruz's autopsy, you're claiming that those all came from an accidental fall, is that right?
Well, my determination is that the manner of death is an accident.
Right, okay. So you were asked about pushing the rake into her back. Your testimony is that you've not seen those kinds of injuries before.
No, my testimony was that my training and experience has not identified situations where something with multiple objects on it have been able to be pushed in. That's what you were describing, right? Somebody standing and pushing into somebody's back multiple times into somebody's body at the same time.
You've seen the rake, correct?
I've seen pictures of it.
Or photos of it. You could take the rake, if you wanted to do it, and push it into somebody's back and stab them, right?
So what I said was, I do not, in my experience, you cannot do that with multiple times on a rake.
Now about the rake itself that you've seen pictures of, you could take the rake and push it into somebody's back and use it as a weapon. Isn't that correct?
Objection, Your Honor. I think this is asked and answered.
Overruled.
In my experience and in my opinion, you cannot do that.
You can't do that, but you can fall on the rake. You can't push the rake into somebody. Is that what you're telling us?
I'm saying in my experience and my training, no, you can't. But again, I am not a biomechanical engineer, so I can't answer that for you with...
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'll finish.
I cannot answer that for you with calculations, but I'm telling you from my training and experience, I've not seen that, and I have not I have not experienced that. And
Okay.
I do not believe that you could take multiple times and just push them into somebody intentionally.
But you can fall on the rake and that could happen.
Correct, because you're getting enough force to fall on the rake.
Okay, I'm doing
How
those
about
Google searches
kick the
that
rake
could get me
into
in
her
trouble.
back or stomp on it if they put the rake against her skin or put the rake against her back? That could happen?
So theoretically that could happen. I can't answer about the forces on that, but I've also not been presented with any information that suggests that that's what happened.
Googling how many pounds of pressure is needed to puncture skin. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll clear this one when I'm done.
Dr. Hammers, you indicated that you take into account the investigation, correct?
Yes.
That would include all information that's been provided to you?
Yes.
I assume if you were missing some information or you thought you were, you would request that?
If I felt like there was something out there that would help me with my analysis, I would ask for it, yes.
And information that, particularly since Todd Mullis was the suspect here, statements from him would be potentially relevant to your determination. Isn't that true?
Are you asking the ones that I had or something?
No, I'm just asking you in general terms. I mean, statements that he would have made about what happened would be relevant to your determination.
They could be, yes.
His motive might be part of that.
Again, it could be.
If he had a reason to kill Amy Mullis, that would be something you would factor in?
It would be, and it would be something I would factor in. It would, I would take it with the other information.
I mean, if a defendant confesses to a shooting, you might call that a homicide, or at least factor in a statement if they confessed to that type of crime. Is that right?
I would say I wouldn't necessarily call it a homicide just because of their statement, and if it didn't make sense that it could be a homicide from my autopsy, then I wouldn't call it a homicide just because somebody told me it was a homicide. I would use that as a piece of information with the rest of my examination.
And if a defendant would confess to a stabbing, that might contribute to your finding that it's a homicide. Is that correct?
Again, I wouldn't make that determination off of somebody's confession. I would make it off of the entire amount of information that I have. Again, if it didn't make sense that someone could stab that person based off of the circumstances and the set of injuries, then I wouldn't call it a homicide just because somebody was confessing to it.
And if Todd Mullis in this case made the statement that Amy was a cheating whore, or that she needed to...
I'm sorry, I apologize, Your Honor.
Or that she needed to go to hell because she was a cheating whore, would you factor that in?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'm sorry I interrupted. Please continue.
This is evidence that was at the trial.
This is I guess the question is if. So with that understanding, I'll withdraw my question, or my objection, Your Honor.
Right. The witness may answer.
So again, I would take that into consideration as information that I would have.
Did you factor that in this case?
To my knowledge, I did not have that information.
Okay. Does that change your opinion if you made those statements?
It does not.
Okay. Yep, that's all I have. Thank you.
Some of the things lawyers say in court.
Just a couple of questions, Your Honor. Wounds A through F are not stab wounds, in your opinion. Is that right?
Correct.
And are your opinions in this case dependent on whether Ms. Mullis experienced the injuries that we're talking about in this case in the shed of the Mullis farm or somewhere else?
No, they're not dependent on her being in the shed.
Have you received any information that there's been any confession in this case by Todd Mullis?
I have not been given any information that indicates that Mr. Mullis stated that he intentionally harmed Amy.
Is it your understanding there's any statement by Mr. Mullis that he intentionally or otherwise harmed her?
No, to my knowledge, I have not reviewed anything to that end.
You were asked some questions about the sort of the nature of your disagreement with Dr. Cruz and whether there's things you agree on and things you disagree on. Do you disagree with the sort of objective measurements and objective data that Dr. Cruz developed from the autopsy?
I do not.
Do you disagree with her interpretation of this autopsy?
I do.
Do you disagree with the cause and manner of death that Dr. Cruz ascribed to this autopsy? Or ascribed to Ms. Mullis's death, excuse me.
Yes, I do.
Do you is your conclusion that this was an accident, does that necessarily exclude the possibility that this was a homicide?
I mean, in the realm of all things possible, anything is possible, but we are asked and tasked with the job of reviewing all of the information and making an opinion decision about the manner of death, and what is reasonable, what is likely, and what is most likely, and matches with all of the and is consistent with all of the information that we have available.
One moment, Your Honor.
All right. The idea that you can't swing a rake and stab somebody in the back with it, especially a rake like this, which only has 4 sharpened tines.
Any recross?
I'm not buying that.
Nothing else.
Thank you, Doctor. You may step
I
down.
understand you can lay down on a bed of nails and not get any puncture wounds. Your weight distribution can make that happen.
Certainly.
But swinging
Judge,
a rake...
while we're waiting on schedule, I have a 3:30 matter I need to take up, so I may need to leave. I think I mentioned this maybe yesterday. That's even if we don't have a break, I may just get up and leave. Is that okay with you?
It's okay with me unless you would like us to
wait for you.
The next witness is not mine, so I'm good. So I just don't want to delay things, please. So
I cannot find any other corn rake deaths.
Ms. Thompson, did you want to start your next witness, or do you want to take a short break before we do that?
What's the court's preference?
I wish we were done right now, would be my preference.
Keep going. Okay, right. We can get started, it sounds like.
Sounds good. Okay. All right. We call Dr. Valentina Nny, Your Honor.
Dr. Valentina Nny. Next up.
Dr. Nny, you can take your time, come forward and have a seat in the chair to my left, please.
Okay, this is the biomechanical engineer, right? She's the one who's going to recreate this for us, so we understand how
So
it
the
works.
testimony you're about to give will be true and correct.
I do.
You can have a seat. You can turn that microphone on in front of you there once you're seated.
Red light's on. Oh, she looks familiar. Where have we seen her? Have we seen her before?
Whenever you're ready, Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Nny.
Good afternoon.
Can you introduce yourself to the court?
Yes, I am Valentina Nny. VALENTINA NGAI.
Dr. Nny, were you retained by Mr. Mullis's counsel to provide opinions in this case?
No, the firm I work for was retained and I was assigned to the case.
Thank you, and we'll get into that in a minute. Can you tell the court what your profession is?
Yes, I am a biomechanical engineer.
In brief terms, what is a biomedical and biomechanical engineer?
So biomedical is the overarching heading that it's called, and essentially it is the application of scientific and engineering principles to biological systems to solve problems. And biomechanical engineering is a subset under biomedical engineering that specifically studies the response of biological tissues to applied forces and motions.
Do you hold any degrees in the field of biomedical or biomechanical engineering?
Yes, well, I have 3 engineering degrees.
What are those degrees?
I have an undergraduate in civil engineering. I have a master's in mechanical engineering, specializing in biomechanics, one of my specialties. And I have a PhD in biomedical engineering. Again, one of my specialties is biomechanical.
You're not a medical doctor, Dr. Nny.
That is correct. I am not a medical doctor.
How is biomedical engineering different from being a medical doctor?
Medical doctors are trained to diagnose and treat injuries. That is not what I do. I do not diagnose and treat. My job as an engineer is to consider the forces and motions and how the body responds to those forces and motions.
You mentioned it was your company that was retained by Mr. Mullis' counsel. Where is it that you currently work?
I work for Robson Forensic.
And what kind of company is that?
It's a consulting firm that employs multidisciplinary expertise, and we basically run investigations.
How is biomedical or biomechanical engineering used in the field of forensics?
Well, oftentimes I've been a forensic biomechanical engineer for almost 15 years. And my role is essentially if there is a person that has some sort of diagnosed injuries due to mechanical forces, it's my role oftentimes is to determine the mechanical cause of that injury and how and if it relates to the subject event.
What does your work with Robson Forensics entail?
I run scientific investigations. So again, I'm one of the biomechanical engineers on staff. I'm a full-timer. I'm the head of the biomechanical engineering group. I'm the head of the medical device group, and I'm also the director of engineering there.
You said that your company conducts investigations. Who do you conduct those investigations for?
It depends.
What kinds of clients does your company have?
Oftentimes our clients are for litigation, but we are a neutral third-party firm, so we conduct investigations for both. If you're talking about civil, it's going to be plaintiff or defense, and for criminal, prosecution and defense, and we also do non-litigation type investigations as well.
Is there a type of client that is, for the cases that you work on, is there one side or the other that your firm predominantly works for?
No, we're probably pretty even. I know for myself, I'm probably in civil cases 60%, 40% plaintiff defense, but my testimony is probably about equal, 50-50.
You've explained to us what biomedical engineering is. Is that a subspecialty within the more general field of engineering?
Yes, if you think about the classical disciplines, you have civil, mechanical, electrical. Biomedical is, again, one of those classifications under the overarching heading of engineering.
And is this a field that graduate students study specifically in school?
Oh, yes. Undergraduate, graduate, professors,
Extensively.
Industry, medical, biomechanical engineers are everywhere.
Are there biomechanical engineering university programs here in Iowa?
Yes, University of Iowa has a very renowned biomedical engineering program. So actually, the president of our firm is a graduate of that program.
Now, you talked about your degrees. What kinds of courses have you taken in the context of your study that has related specifically to the medical aspects of biomechanical engineering?
So I am the interface between engineering and the human body. Therefore, I have to understand not only engineering and physics concepts, I need to understand the anatomy of the human body. So I take the same anatomy courses as medical doctors do. Cadaver labs. I've held human body parts in my hands, not only for schooling, but for my actual work in my studies.
It's a strange flex.
Part of my theses and contract work as a research scientist.
Are you familiar with the field of injury biomechanics?
Yes.
What is that?
So injuries are specifically defined in biomedical engineering as a failure of biological tissue. As an engineer, it's also my job to understand how tissues fail, so material science aspects. Because part of engineering is understanding and developing and designing using materials. Therefore, we have to understand how they fail.
Have you worked in your career on issues that involve injury biomechanics?
Absolutely, yes.
And can you give us some examples of situations that involve an investigation into injury biomechanics?
Well, just in my forensic career alone, aside from my research scientist years as in my graduate program and as well as consulting projects, in my career at Robson as a forensic engineer, as I said, oftentimes somebody's got some sort of claimed or diagnosed injury, and there's either competing scenarios of how it happened, or you find a body and there's injuries to it and somebody needs to know what happened to it. What kind of forces and motions did that body sustain, experience to get those injuries? That's where I come in.
Do you have research experience in the field of injury biomechanics also?
Yes.
And briefly, what has your research into that field entailed?
Well, a lot of my research had to do with, again, it's about the human body and how it functions, but also how to make it better, right? So when you're learning and part of the evaluation process for, say, joint prostheses, you have to understand how the tissues respond and how they failed in the first place, and how they will respond with the devices that we are developing.
Have you done research specifically on issues that have involved lower extremity biomechanics?
Yes.
Are there any differences in lower extremity biomechanics as opposed to other types of injury biomechanics?
So if you look at my CV, predominantly my publications are in, they're all engineering related. I have eyes, I have lower extremities, I have hips, knees, but the fact is a human tissue, right? So human tissues, being materials failure, have a specific type of failure generation when it's applied to particular sets of loading. And even though you publish in one area doesn't mean that that's the only area you work on. I've written a grant for spine research. I'm part of the Orthopedic Research Society, a member of the spine section, a member of the orthopedic implant group, as well as other memberships in other societies. And this is all in addition to my work as a forensic engineer for almost 15 years.
All right, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 285.
I got hips, I got eyes. She said it.
And let me know when that's in front of you, doctor.
Yes.
If you need us to scroll through this, let us know. But is Exhibit 285 a true and accurate copy of your CV and your reports in this case?
Well, I only see the first page.
Let me show you just a paper copy of that, if I could. Do you need this? I may.
Thank you.
The top document in what's been handed to you should be a copy of Exhibit 285. And if you could just look at that and let me know if that's a true and accurate copy of your CV and your reports from this case.
Yes, this is volume 1 of my CV. I always had to stretch to get mine onto 2 pages. How much blank space is acceptable on the CV? Double space.
Have you finished looking at Exhibit 285?
Yes, just briefing over it. It appears to be, that is my current CV. It needs to be updated, but that's what I have right now.
What is not contained in the copy in your CV? What is not updated about your CV that's reflected in Exhibit 285?
I've been meaning to do it. I just haven't had time. I've had numerous guest lectures since then. I've had presentations to medical facilities. I present to medical facilities, to fellows, to surgeons, to medical staff. So I definitely know that I did a presentation for Grand Rounds and Didactics for the Scripps La Jolla in San Diego. I've had multiple guest lectures, and I've also recently just ran a one-day workshop for a large sports manufacturing company talking about injury biomechanics.
Nike?
Now, you mentioned that you work for this company, Robson Forensics. Is that your only current employment?
That's my full-time employment. I work at a gym.
I do
for
that
fun.
in Uber.
One day a week.
That sounds like a passion project, not something you do for money.
I mean, not for money, but I do get paid.
Is there anything else you're doing for employment currently?
Uber.
No. That is. I mean,
chance, Uber.
So it depends. Depends on guest lectures. Some facilities will pay me to do guest lectures. That sports manufacturing company paid me to conduct a one-day workshop. So do I have constant? But I have these employment opportunities.
Does your salary with Robson Forensics depend on the outcome of any of the cases that your company consults on?
No. Regardless of the cases I have, the number of cases, or the outcome, my salary stays the same.
All right. Do you work on any, or have you worked on any cases where ultimately after the work that you've performed, the client elects not to use your opinions?
Yes, that is not unusual.
Is that a concern for you or your company when that happens?
No, not at all.
Because they've already paid us.
We are third-party investigators, so whatever the science and the investigation yields, that's the findings. Whether it's, say, good or not favorable for the client that retained us, that is our answer.
I want to hear what experiments she
have
did.
you been qualified by courts in the field of biomechanical and biomedical engineering?
Yes, by federal as well as numerous state courts, yes.
Have you ever had a court determine you were not qualified as an expert?
Not that I know of, and that recently came up at a trial I was at, and they actually ran my name through all the databases that attorneys have access to, and in almost 15 years they did not find one motion that was ever successful in disqualifying my qualifications or my opinions.
Your Honor, obviously I'm a pro hoc attorney here, so I'm less familiar with the Iowa procedures. This is the point where I would tender the witness as an expert, but I understand that's not the court's practice here. But I don't know if this is the point at which the court would offer a voir dire.
Any additional record that the state wishes to make at this point?
Your Honor, the state stands by its prior objections as it related to the use of specifically Dr. Nye's first report as it would qualify as vouching. I believe that shouldn't be considered here. We do have a question as to what would be included in that binder. There's portions of it that are not appended to Exhibit 285, so I think now would be potentially an opportune time to take our afternoon break.
Oh.
Okay, and I think at this point we were just taking up the expert witness issue, and I was just asking if there was any additional record you wanted to make.
No additional record other than our prior rules. Obviously, as Mr. Brown noted earlier, we're not a Daubert state, so.
Yep, okay. And again, certainly the court believes that the witness is qualified, so I don't think we have any problems there.
Iowa doesn't need expert
I understand we
designation.
might have
That's
some
crazy.
issues with regard to Exhibit 285, and it sounds like the state wants to clarify that. Why don't we go ahead and take about 15 minutes for our afternoon break at this point. Doctor, you may step down. We'll plan on picking back up hopefully about 2:45. Court is in recess until then.
15 minutes till 2:45. Okay, so I'm a little bit behind. Break's almost over, guys. Break is almost over. We're going to get caught up right now. Okay, break's going to be over in about a minute. Oh, we got a prank call. How does this happen? must be watching the show. Hello? Hello?
Hi, this is Michael. How are you doing today? Doing good?
Oh, hi.
Well, this call is about auto insurance rates are pretty low. I believe you have insurance on your car, right?
They are low.
Okay, so if you get a better deal than what you're paying right now, would you at least think about it maybe as an option?
What would I think about what? Hello? He's putting like 3 sentences together all at once. Auto insurance are really low right now. We have it, right? Like, see ya. Yeah, Michael. Sorry. Put Mary on the phone. I want to talk to Mary. Okay, here's what I want to know. With this witness who is about to testify, biomechanical engineer. These are the people who get to do the fun tests, right? I'm envisioning this is how I think it's going to go. She's like, well, when you were hired to investigate into this, what steps did you take to recreate this scenario? And she's like, well, I went down to Lowe's and I bought a corn rake, and then I went to the butcher shop and I bought a whole pig. And then we went out back and I spread out a tarp on the ground and I started swinging. What do you do? What do you do here to say, how can you recreate this scenario to see if it works? Watermelon first. Pig is, though, as wasteful as it is, humans and pigs are practically interchangeable. They're very similar. You'll need many pigs. I mean, I guess when you get down to it, the body farm might be able to supply needed objects for a test. I mean, there's, people donate their humans, their corpse to science. This technically is science, right? Yeah, stop talking about my ex-wife. Oh, man. He has pigs. Yeah, they could have just run down to the farm and, one passed away, sadly. It's like, hey, before you bury that, throw me that corn rake. Oh, never mind. I'll go get it myself. I don't want you to throw anything. Then I duct taped the broomstick to my back and stumbled around. Mallet to the watermelon. Yes. Oh, my goodness. Can't believe the other witness stated with a straight face the victim fell 3 times on the corn rake with enough force to penetrate, but nope, can't have been swung because no one has ever done it before. I got on my Google searches today are probably going to get me in big trouble, but I was using Grok, I was using AI, I'm like using the research tools, any record of somebody who's died from a corn rake, and Amy Mullis is the only one that came up. I'm sure if I include it to branch out into, say, horror films, that would grow because there are characters in horror films, I'm sure, that have died from corn rakes and chainsaws and everything else. But nothing in the world of true crime. I forgot where I was going with that, but oh yeah, the testimony that you could not push the corn rake into. Well, she's prepping. She's getting ready. She's all ready. Anyway, you could not push the corn rake into her body. And that made me think. We've got an outer layer of clothing that has fewer holes than her body. And my understanding is the testimony is that the outer layer stayed on her the entire time. They didn't take her coat off and it was just going with her to the hospital. So if I'm trying to see it the way that Mr. Mullis' team is presenting this, if it was an accident that she fell on it, she would have fallen, it would have punctured the coat and her. Then she would have tried to get up and it's still in her back and she falls again on it. She tries to get up and she falls again the 3rd time. That way you've got, it's still hang on to the coat, but her body came out of it. Does that make sense? It seems to be a stretch in a big way. I can't quite see it happening like that. Husband said cost was pushed up when we found her, but Oh, coat was pushed up? Huh. Witness just went and got another degree on break. It was just a doctorate, that was all. It's just a doctorate. Goats randomly faint, that's where he got the idea. Okay, there are like 3 things that will survive a nuclear blast. Cockroaches, all Carhartt clothing, and I don't know what the third thing is. You guys, fill in the blank. What's the third thing? It's tough material. A corn rake. Twinkies. Yes, Twinkies are the last one. Apparently it's unanimous. Everyone's saying Twinkies. Keith Richards. Keith Richards will survive. My Mrs. Amazon bill. That'll survive the nuclear blast. Did I say nuclear blast? I hope I did. I'll try my defense with this theory. I can tell you why, Cookie. As difficult as it is to piece together and say, yeah, that sounds reasonable, they have to show that defense should have, that his defense in the previous trial should have presented this argument, that it was wrong for them to say, yep, it clearly was murder, it just wasn't him. They need to show that there's an argument, there's evidence that could be presented to a jury that the jury could believe and find that this was in fact an accident. If they do that and convince the judge that they have enough evidence for the jury to believe that, then they say, look, we should get a new trial because our last legal team messed up. They should have presented this and they didn't. Instead, they waved the white flag and said, yep, you got us. It was murder. It just wasn't our guy. Cockroaches wearing cart. I'm jumping right on X right now. I think I can get a picture of this. Grok, create a picture of a cockroach wearing Carhartt. Done. It's thinking. It's thinking. Slowly building it. Oh, these are creepy. Do you want big head or little head? Save it to Black Magic. I'm going to show you this picture. We're doing just big, just doing big. And I need camera 3 to be available. Where's that? Oh, I need 7. Help, I lost my mouse. Okay, here we go. Save as. Oh, I have to download it. There we go. Yeah, I'm bringing you the picture. It's worth waiting for. It really is. I know you all are waiting patiently for this. You all could have made it yourself in this time as well. All right, so this is creepy and might give you nightmares, but here we go. These are the two things that are going to survive a nuclear blast right there. Thanks to Grok for that one. Appreciate you creating that image. That was so bad. Look at this. He looks so happy. He's got a smile and everything. Oh, yeah. All right. Just waiting to come back to court. I need to get rid of that picture because now he's in the corner. There we go. Be back to normal, mostly. Okay. There went my lunch. Yeah. For those of you who have never tried AI before, it is that easy.
Please be seated.
You too can make pictures of cockroaches wearing Carhartt.
All right, we'll go back in the record. Dr. Nny, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think before the break, and during the break, we conferred with the state about Exhibit 285, and we are seeking to offer Exhibit 285 into evidence, which is Dr. Nny's CV and her report.
Any objections to 285?
Yes, based on hearsay grounds, Your Honor, and for the reasons stated earlier during our off-the-record discussion in chambers.
I will take those objections under advisement. We'll continue for purposes of this examination so that we can keep moving. Go ahead, Ms. Thompson.
And Your Honor, we have a binder of materials if the witness needs to reference them, which the state has looked at.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nny, you were present in court for Dr. Cruz's and Dr. Hammers' testimony, is that right?
Yes.
And you've heard some testimony over the course of the last 2 days about the scientific method?
Yes.
Is the scientific method a process that you apply in your work?
Absolutely. Sorry, I heard about the description more so today from Dr. Hammers' testimony.
Now, let me ask you this. Are you familiar with something called a biomechanical investigation?
Yes, absolutely.
What is that?
It's a scientific investigation to often determine the mechanical cause of an injury and if and how it relates to a specific event.
Do you apply the scientific method when you perform a biomechanical investigation?
Yes, absolutely.
And I don't want to, without going into detail, can you just tell us briefly what the steps are that you follow when you perform a biomechanical investigation?
Sure, yes. Just like all of us have taken in elementary school, if you remember back to your days of science, the scientific method is a foundational methodology to ensure that experiments and investigations are run so that they're repeatable and reliable. The first step is to have a hypothesis, a purpose. The next step is to develop a hypothesis or hypotheses. You can have more than one. The next step is to have materials and methods, right? So reviewing materials, gathering information, and then conducting necessary analyses to test those hypotheses. And based on the results of your analyses, then you can arrive at conclusions that then address the hypotheses that you set forth and specifically the purpose.
Dr. Nny, are you going to testify to opinions that you hold as to Mr. Mullis's case?
Yes.
And are the opinions that you're going to provide in this testimony opinions that you hold to a reasonable degree of biomechanical certainty?
Yes.
How did you first become involved in Mr. Mullis's case?
I believe that one of the attorneys for Mr. Mullis contacted Robson Forensics.
And without discussing any conclusions that you reached, what was the initial purpose that you were What was the initial work that you were asked to do in this case?
Sorry, I didn't finish. Once they contacted Robson Forensic, the inquiry came in, and then I was assigned to the case.
And I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay.
I was just going to ask what you were assigned to do initially.
Okay, so so after that, we typically speak to the person that called us to determine whether or not I have the expertise that is necessary for their specific investigation. So in this case, my purpose was basically at that time to determine the mechanism of specific diagnosed injuries in Ms. Mullis.
Were you originally contacted to act as a peer reviewer for another biomechanical expert?
Initially, that's how it turned out.
Right. And did you issue a report at that stage of your involvement in this case?
Yes.
At some point, did your work in this case change?
Yes.
And how did it change?
So initially, as a peer reviewer, I'm reviewing someone else's investigation to make sure that it is technically sound, following all the steps of the scientific method, and applying the engineering and scientific principles appropriately. I don't conduct the investigation myself. I'm just overseeing, essentially, the technical aspects. When that changed was when I was asked to conduct my own independent investigation.
Is the report that you originally provided peer review on a report for someone named Dr. Susan Bully?
Yes.
And Your Honor, based on the testimony, again, we'd seek to admit Dr. Bully's report, but we would ask to defer argument on that issue, Your Honor.
Understood.
For your investigation, so not talking about the stage of this case where you were a peer reviewer, talking now about when your work in this case changed, did you conduct a biomechanical investigation with respect to Ms. Mullis's injuries in this case?
Yes.
And you described earlier your process of conducting a biomechanical investigation. Did you follow that process in your work in this case?
Yes.
You told us step one is to identify a purpose. What was your purpose?
My purpose, initially with reviewing some basic information, was to determine whether the mechanism, or generally the forces necessary to cause Ms. Mullis's diagnosed injuries, were generated due to a swinging stabbing event, as was presented in the criminal trials transcripts that I reviewed, or whether it was due to a falling incident, which multiple records indicate, such as the 911 call.
Is a biomechanical investigation something that you can do on the spot?
No.
What does that process entail in terms of time?
Oh, it depends case to case. This is a very complicated case. It requires a lot of consideration and steps in reviewing case materials, the physical evidence, looking at 3D dimensional analyses, everything involved, the people, the diagnosed injuries, the implement, consideration of the spaces, the space involved, the mechanism of the injuries, scientific and medical literature review, calculations, applying scientific principles such as conservation of energy and laws of physics. It is a very arduous investigation sometimes.
I understood that from your description of your purpose that you were evaluating competing hypotheses in this case.
They weren't competing necessarily, they're just different.
But multiple possible hypotheses is what I meant.
Multiple proffered hypotheses, yes.
Understood. And I know that's step 2 of your process as you described. I want to come back to that, and I want to start with what case materials you reviewed in this case. You mentioned that you reviewed a report from Dr. Susan Bully, is that right?
Yes.
What else did you review in terms of case materials other than Dr. Bully's report?
When I conduct my own investigation, I have to review all the case materials myself. So that includes all incident information, specifically the police department documentation, photos, records, reports, interviews. As we established, I'm not a medical doctor, therefore I rely on the medical diagnoses set forth in the medical records. And of course, when I talk about all incident information, I'm referring to photos and documentation. So I'm looking at information that tells me what has happened in the incident because I wasn't there, and what the claims are.
Did you rely on medical materials from Dr. Kelly Cruz and Dr. Thompson in Region Medical Center?
Absolutely, yes.
Did you review any accounts from Tristan Mullis or Todd Mullis in conducting your investigation?
Sure, like I said, I reviewed the police documentation, and there are multiple interviews in there.
Right. Did you, in order to reach your determinations, assume that those accounts from Tristan Mullis and Todd Mullis were true or false? Or did you depend on a determination that those accounts were true or false?
No, I don't rely on that. That's why science is fundamentally based in science. It's based on physical evidence, application of physics and engineering principles, and not based on subjective accounts. Now, there's always competing witness testimony. I might do my analyses and go back and compare to what was said or stated, but I don't use that as the basis for a starting point.
Did you rely on any photos or documents from the Delaware County Sheriff's Office?
Yes.
What did you look at?
They had information regarding the shed, the rake, the clothing. They also had photos of Ms. Mullis's body, and they had, dimensions. They had dimensions of the shed as well.
Did you conduct your own inspection of Ms. Mullis's clothing?
Yes.
Meaning you yourself physically looked at it?
I myself physically looked at it, yes.
Did you yourself physically look at the rake in this case?
Yes.
Did you yourself go to inspect the shed or any other buildings on the Mullis farm?
Yes, I went to visit the farm and the shed.
Did you did you rely on any opinions of Dr. Jennifer Hammers in reaching your conclusions?
Partly, again, a lot of the diagnosis of injuries, as we heard today, her and Dr. Cruz agree on the injury pattern. Did you rely on any other opinions of any other experts in reaching your opinions in this case? No, not that I can think of, no.
All right, and you said that you relied on the injury pattern in this case from Dr. Cruz and from Dr. Hammers, is that right?
Yes.
And you've heard the testimony from both of those witnesses so far about what that injury pattern was?
The testimony as well as the autopsy report, yes.
Understood. And from the testimony from Dr. Jennifer Hammers today, was the testimony that she gave today about the injury pattern on Ms. Mullis's back, did that comport with your understanding of what that injury pattern was?
Yes, it comported with what Dr. Cruz reported in her autopsy report and prior testimony.
All right. Now, you heard Dr. Hammers give some testimony about other injuries to Ms. Mullis besides these 6 wounds A to F on her back, is that right?
Yes.
Did you consider evidence about any of those other injuries on her body in reaching your opinions?
Yes, I mean, I look at all the injuries that are diagnosed on a person. However, the information provided were there are already explanations for the other injuries, so I was asked to focus on the penetration wounds.
Are you offering any opinions one way or another about any injuries on Ms. Mullis's body besides wounds A to F?
I specifically was asked to focus on the penetration wounds, so that's where I spent my investigation time.
Okay. I'm going to show you, and there's been testimony about this, so I want to briefly show you Figure A, which we've talked about earlier in these proceedings. Do you have a figure in front of you?
I do.
All right. What do you understand Figure A to represent?
Figure A is a profile view, so a side view of the basically the human torso. It doesn't have a head, doesn't have legs, doesn't have arms, and what it demonstrates is wounds A to F, the relative penetration depth relative to each other, as well as the orientation. When I say orientation, I mean the trajectories through the body.
And I want to also show you, just for my colleague, A8208. I think we'll just call this demonstrative B for the record. It's A8208. We'll 208. And we'll just refer to this as demonstrative B. Is there another document in front of you? Did you hear testimony about this demonstrative earlier today?
Yes.
Does the information reflected on demonstrative B reflect your understanding of the measurements of the injuries on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes. Well, part of them, only injuries A to B, yes. A and B.
All right. I'm also going to show you what I guess we'll call demonstrative C, which is A8207. Is that in front of you?
Yes.
And does this reflect your understanding of the measurements of wounds B through F?
Basically the linear distances between each wound.
So we're seeing if the rake can cause it because of the spacing. I thought they said it was over a curve, so they're spaced apart.
I'm also going to show you here what we're going to call demonstrative D.
I have a figure up.
All right. Does demonstrative D, third time's a charm, show you the measurements and the depths of wounds B through F?
It is a picture of the back, and it shows me B, C, D, E, and F. It shows me the relative depths of each wound, the linear distances between each of those wounds, and essentially the size of wound.
And does that reflect your understanding of those aspects of the injury pattern on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes, based on Dr. Cruz's autopsy report. It also shows the abrasion above wound D.
All right, and we've had a lot of testimony about these wounds, so I want to ask you about what aspects of these injuries, I want to ask you about some specific aspects of these injuries. What characteristics of the wounds A through F that we've been talking about are important for your biomechanical analysis?
So we can start superficially, more on top of the skin. And as Dr. Hammers testified today, that we heard also reported in Dr. Cruz's autopsy report, each of the wounds have a specific orientation on the wound. So A, B, and C are oriented 10 to 4 o'clock. D has an orientation that's different, about 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock. And E and F are oriented 11 to 5 o'clock. Additionally, the information about the wounds around each puncture, showing that A and B look more diffuse, as Dr. Hammers described today, and then and then the spacing between each wound. Now we go internally, then the trajectories are important to understand where they start and how they move through the body. Gives an indication about the path that they traveled, and understanding that A to D again has a trajectory that's through the body that's near horizontal to the long axis of the body, so perpendicular to the long axis of the body, though slightly downward, and E and F are sharp upward.
Are there any other aspects or characteristics of those wounds that's important to understand that was important for you to understand for your biomechanical analysis in this case?
Well, the abrasion as well is something that I consider.
And why is that?
It's just another piece of information.
You heard testimony from Dr. Hammers that in terms of the orientation of these wounds, that she grouped them into wounds that have different orientations. Is that right?
Yes, they self-group. Yeah,
right.
10 to 4 o'clock, A to C, D's on its own, and E and F.
All right. So in general, and in considering your testimony about your biomechanical investigation, you're discussing and considering human anatomy and reaching your decisions in this case, is that right?
Yes.
And if you're not a doctor, how are you able to do that?
As we discussed, I'm the bridge between engineering and medical, the biological tissue. So I, again, take the same anatomy classes as medical doctors. I take cadaver lab. I've taken cadaver lab. Have access to cadavers through my work at hospitals. I've held human body parts in my hand.
She said that twice now.
I mean, that's part of my job, is to understand the human body and how it fails.
Have you taken a corn rake to one?
Did you hear some testimony from Dr. Hammers that these injuries, these penetrating injuries, are from blunt penetrating forces?
Yes.
And is that important to your analysis?
Yes.
Why is it?
Because the mechanism, when I talk about mechanism of injury, I'm talking about the type and direction of forces necessary to cause an injury. We're not talking about magnitude anymore. Oftentimes when I say force, people just think it's a number, but it's much more complicated than that. So type and direction designates a mechanism of injury. And blunt force injuries have different mechanisms than sharp force injuries. So blunt force injuries the tissue fails due to tensile loading. Essentially, you add tension to the tissue and it overloads past its failure point.
So it tears.
Before we go through the possible hypotheses that you considered in this case, I want to talk to you about your investigation of the rake and the clothing in this case. So I think it was your testimony a minute ago that you examined yourself the actual rake, and that's connected with this case. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you take your own photographs and your own measurements of the corn rake?
Yes.
I'm going to show the witness what's been marked as Exhibit 929.
Wayne, you've been talking to Thal too much.
Do you recognize Exhibit 929?
Yes.
What is it?
It's a photo I took when I went to inspect the rake.
And is that a true and accurate copy of how the rake looked when you examined it?
Yes, it appears to be.
All right, Your Honor, we'd offer Exhibit 929 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
929 is admitted.
You understand that the investigation into this case suggested that this corn rake caused the injuries in Ms. Mullis's back, is that right?
Yes.
Did anything about your investigation suggest that wasn't true?
No.
All right. You measured the corn rake when you looked at it?
Yes.
And what was it, what if anything did you note about this corn rake that was important for your analysis in this case?
It's important for me to understand the geometric, dimensional, and intrinsic properties of the rake. It has a specific shape, right? So if you stand the rake on its wooden handle on the very end, the tines themselves essentially point sideways. So not quite 90 degrees, a little bit lower than 90 degrees, so closer to the ground. And the spacing between the tines, there's 4 tines, as we've all heard, is a little less than 3 inches. The whole rake is about 37 inches long. It weighs about 2.6 pounds, and the center of mass of the rake is closer to the rake head. So it's basically top heavy. And it's metal. So the head of the rake is metal, the handle is wood, so it is essentially stiff, right? This rake, for me to understand, is a stiff implement relative to the human body. So if you're going to put the two together, it's the human body that's going to deform.
I want to show you as well Exhibit 938.
Got it.
Do you recognize what Exhibit 938 is, Dr. Nny?
Yes.
What is it?
It is a view from the top. So if I'm looking at the tines, and the tines like towards my face, I'm looking at the top of a tine, essentially.
Is the tine in that photograph for, I don't know the term you would use, but in a caliper or a measuring device of some kind?
It is in a caliper, yes.
And the tine is in the middle of that caliper?
Yes.
Does Exhibit 938 truly and accurately depict a more close-up view of one of the tines of the rake at the time you observed it when you examined it?
Yes.
All right, and at this time, Your Honor, I would offer Exhibit 938 into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
938 is admitted.
As to this, I'm sorry. Specifically as to the tines of the corn rake, was there anything about the properties of the tines that was important to your analysis?
Yes, looking at the tips. Again, the spacing we talked about, the length, the shape, that it's stiff, but again, the tips themselves were very, they're not sharp, they're not pointy.
And why is the fact that in your view these are not sharp or pointy, why is that important to your analysis here?
Because as we discussed, it has a different mechanism of injury. And you know, they're kind of flat in a sense, just the way Dr. Hammers described today. If I were to compare them to something that people are experienced with, they're essentially kind of like a flathead screwdriver if you think about it. And if you compare the cross-sectional area of the tip, which is in this picture, for a 1/4 inch wide flathead screwdriver, the tips essentially have a bigger surface area than the tip of a flathead screwdriver.
Why does that matter?
Because in the biomechanical studies, flathead screwdrivers are considered blunt instruments.
Is it?
This is a blunt instrument?
In your assessment, this is blunter than a flathead screwdriver?
This is blunter than a flathead screwdriver based on the measurements, yes. In addition, it's rusty.
Tell that to the TSA.
So it's not smooth.
They
it's
won't
not
let me take this on a plane.
new, so it's not perfectly machined. You know, so again, this is something that has wear and tear on it.
Why does that matter?
Again, wear and tear, just like knives. You know, you use them over time, they get more blunt.
Now, you said in your testimony that the mechanism of injury is different for this type of object. Different from what?
Well, different from sharp force, right? So if you talk about sharp force, tissues fail under compression. So this is basically a tensile loading. So you put something that's blunt against the skin or any kind of material, and you push through it, it basically generates a tensile loading, and it's the tensile loading that causes failure. And why that's important is because in literature it provides information about the thresholds for human skin to fail under tensile loading.
You're using a lot of scientific terms there. So when you talk about the tensile loading that would cause human skin to fail, in layperson's terms, what does that concept mean?
Like ripping apart. You know, if you were to, you know, again, rip something apart rather than push it together, biological materials are anisotropic, and they have different characteristics and different failure mechanisms and different thresholds for failure depending on how you apply the force to it.
I want to talk more about how those concepts apply in this case, but I want to ask you first about your evaluation of Miss Mullis's clothing. You had a chance to investigate inspect yourself Miss Mullis's clothing. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you evaluate? Did you evaluate the different layers of clothing that Miss Mullis was wearing at the time she was taken to the hospital in this case?
Yes.
And was there anything important? Was there anything relevant to your analysis that you noted when you inspected her clothing?
Looking at the holes. Again, this is information and evidence that needs to be considered. So the undershirt and the sweatshirt had the same number of holes as Dr. Heimer has described today, 5 of which were in the area of the 5 of the wounds. Remember, she has 6 wounds, and there was a cluster of holes in the sweatshirt and the undershirt that was consistent with being caused by a single tine. Additionally, the coat itself had the same area of the location of wounds except for wound D. So again, we have less holes in the clothing than there are in the body.
When you examined the jacket that Miss Mullis was wearing at the time she was taken to the hospital, how many holes did you see in that jacket?
In the area, in the location of the wounds, 5.
And when you examined the clothing, did you make any holes in it?
No.
That's good.
Can you yourself account, well, let me ask you this. Did you hear testimony from Dr. Cruz that at autopsy they identified 4 holes in a photograph?
Yes, I know that photograph.
All right, and can you personally account for why there is a difference in the number of holes that you saw and the number of holes that were photographed at Dr. Cruz's autopsy?
All I can say is that the photos from the autopsy, that additional hole wasn't as prominent as when I went. When I went, that hole was prominent, and it matched up with the holes on the underclothes.
In general, why were you inspecting the clothing that Ms. Mullis was taken to the hospital in?
Again, it's all information. It's important to consider the physical evidence when running an investigation and making conclusions.
You've talked a second ago about the tensile strength needed to break human skin. In a biomechanical analysis that involves someone wearing clothing, is it important to understand characteristics of the clothing?
Yes, absolutely.
And why is that?
Because different clothing have different properties. Again, it's material science, right? So different materials will have different failure thresholds.
Crimes in nudist colonies must be much easier to investigate because there's no clothing involved.
And how it applies here is that Ms. Mullis was, as we've heard, was wearing multiple layers of clothes, one being a very thick, I guess it was described as a Carhartt jacket with fleece inside based on my inspection.
I want to go back and show you demonstrative D. In total, with your understanding of the wound pattern that Ms. Mullis had on her back, the rake that we've been talking about in her clothing, did you draw any conclusions about the mechanism of Ms. Mullis's injuries based on all of that data?
Yes, that it was tensile overload due to penetration from a blunt object.
And in layperson's terms, Dr. Nny, what does that mean?
It means that the skin was pushed apart by something that was not sharp, and when you push it against it, it kind of pulls the skin apart and it fails under tension. Tension is pulling apart.
Did you hear Dr. Hammers' testimony about the pattern of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back with respect to the spacing of the wounds on Ms. Mullis's back?
Yes.
And did that give you an understanding of the mechanism by which Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries?
So again, the mechanism is the same. It's going to be tensile failure due to penetration by a blunt object. But biomechanically, when you look about the spacing between the wounds, and I understood that Dr. Hammers testified from a medical standpoint, I'm testifying from an engineering standpoint. Looking again at the materials, the geometry, the intrinsic properties of the rake. Intrinsic properties of the rake being it's stiff, it's not malleable relative to the human body. It has essentially fixed spacing between the tines. I can then compare it to the wounds diagnosed on Ms. Mullis's body.
And did you conduct that comparison in this case?
Yes.
And what conclusions, if any, did you draw from that comparison?
Again, similar to the medical side that Dr. Hammers testified to, when you hyperextend, your skin on your back compresses, basically it squeezes together, and when an implement that's stiff like this punctures the skin, you then lay the body flat and flatten out the body. The wounds then are spaced apart. So the wounds are going to be farther apart than the spacing between the tines, which is what we have here.
And so did this biomechanical analysis that you did, coupled with the medical information that you had from Dr. Cruz's autopsy and the spacing information that you had, did that give you an understanding of the position of Ms. Mullis's back at the time that she experienced these injuries?
Yes, that she was slightly hyperextended.
Hyperextended how?
Arching or rotated.
And you're making a motion here, and when you say that she was hyperextended, was she hyperextended on both sides?
No, I mean the wounds are on the primarily middle. One is left, but the right side. So she's twisting essentially to her right.
Is it your testimony that, because you've made a motion, I want the, I guess, record to reflect what motion you made. Is the motion that you made a motion that hyperextends your right shoulder back, bringing your elbows closer to your body?
Well, it's basically a slight twist and pulling my shoulders back, kind of like sticking out my chest a little bit.
And pulling your shoulders back, does that decrease the space between, does that decrease some of the spaces in your back when a person does that?
It just compresses the skin. It makes the skin squish together.
And would that dynamic of Ms. Mullis's back being hyperextended when she experienced these injuries, would that explain the spacing of the wounds on her back in the pictures that we've been looking at?
Objection, speculation.
Overruled. The witness can answer if she's able.
Hey.
Yes, I think I've already testified to that.
Todd's
that
team won.
The wounds, the spacing on the wounds are bigger than the spaces between the tines. So that means she has to be hyperextended, which compresses her skin together. So when you lay the body flat, the wounds now are spread farther apart in distance.
You heard some testimony from Dr. Hammers about how she would order the way in which Ms. Mullis received these injuries, the order in which they occurred?
Yes.
Do you, from a biomechanical perspective, do you reach the same result or a different result about the order in which these injuries occurred?
No, biomechanically, I agree that A, B, and C occur in pretty much at the same time. I think that based on the analysis, D happens next, and then E and F.
And why is that from a biomechanical perspective?
Based on the clustering, again, if you look at the injury diagnosis, you have the spacing between A, B, and C, and they're in a linear pattern. Additionally, you have the same orientation on the skin, so 10 to 4 o'clock, and you have the same trajectory through the body being horizontal to the long axis of the body. Now you have D, which is much smaller, less deep, because it's only 2 inches deep, and has a different orientation on the skin. And then you have E and F, which again are clustered together because they have an orientation of 11 to 5 o'clock and the same upward trajectory. Sorry, can I finish?
I'm
sorry. I had a pause there.
Sorry.
Additionally, considering the intrinsic properties of the rake being essentially fixed relative to the human body, it's not going to deform or be malleable. E and F are essentially in the middle of her, E, C, and D are essentially in the middle of her back. Those tines cannot be inserted into the body one at a time. It's kind of like if you look at the palm of your hand and you take a fork, you can't enter one prong through your entire palm without having the other 3 prongs contact you. It's similar here. We have a fixed distance between the tines. So E and F, if you're impacting the body with the rake, that a third tine has to happen somewhere, and we don't have another upward trajectory. So those ones can't happen first. Similarly with D, D is essentially close to the middle of the back. You cannot insert one tine at a time. So D is not going to happen first either. So that leaves A, B, and C.
And did you hear testimony from Dr. Hammers about the theory that there could have been tines that were that were inside wounds A and B, and then have tines go into other wounds while the tines in A and B remained in A and B?
Yes.
From a biomechanical perspective, do you have an opinion on whether that's possible?
Yes, that is what happened based on the analysis that I conducted.
All right, so at this point I think your testimony has been that you identified what the injury pattern was as you understood it. You looked at the rake, you looked at Ms. Mullis's clothing. Did you also look at the shed on the Mullis farm?
Yes.
And I want to just show you Exhibit 731.
It's up.
All right. Do you recognize what's depicted in Exhibit 731?
Yes.
What do you understand Exhibit 731 to depict?
It depicts a photo inside the shed where Dr. Hammers was describing one of the walking paths, one of the very few walking paths.
You said that you yourself visited the shed as well?
Yes.
Does Exhibit 731 look like the shed, the inside of the shed, or the area of the shed that's depicted in 731 when you saw it?
It looks like it.
Why did you go to the shed and look at the shed?
Again, it's information to gather, a data point that needs to be considered.
And why does it need to be considered?
Well, if I have all these essentially different hypotheses to test, I want to understand the space in which the people or claimed people involved, how they fit relative to the spacing. So now we have to consider anthropometrics, the people claimed to be involved, now we know what the implement looks like and how long it is, and I have different hypotheses to test. So I want to know what space I'm working in. You know, am I working in a giant field or am I working in a box?
Was it was it an assumption that you had at the time you tested your hypotheses in this case that the interior of the shed on the Mullis farm was where Ms. Mullis experienced these injuries?
I don't assume.
I mean, did your opinions depend on the interior of the shed being where she experienced these injuries?
No. If I didn't have, now that I conducted my investigation, if I didn't have information about the shed, my opinions wouldn't change.
All right, so you talked about the scientific method. I think we've talked about your purpose. Have we talked about all of the case materials that you reviewed in this case and that you relied on to reach your opinions?
I believe so. The
All
physical
right.
evidence, yes.
Okay. And I think we skipped a step, which was developing hypotheses. And I want to use the right term that you use. I think you said that you considered different possible hypotheses. Is that right?
Well, I considered different hypotheses that were proffered in the material I reviewed.
All right. So you mentioned a moment ago that you had to take that. When you conduct these kinds of biomechanical investigations, you take all of these case materials into account to conduct your assessments. And before we talk about any of the individual hypotheses that you considered in this case, how did you take all this information to test those hypotheses?
So part of the scientific process, after you've developed a purpose and your hypotheses, reviewed case materials, the next part, and we now talked about the mechanism necessary to cause these injuries. The next step is basically to apply engineering and scientific principles to determine whether or not that mechanism is generated in each hypothesis, if and how.
Just as an aside, the process that, well, not as an aside, I want to ask you this. The process that you're describing, is this the same thing as an accident investigation or an incident investigation?
Yes, incident investigation.
Okay. Is what you are doing when you determine whether different hypotheses are possible, is one of the things that you have to do to decide how much force would be necessary to cause whatever hypothesis or whatever hypothesized mechanism you're considering?
No, not all the time.
And why is that?
Because as I defined earlier, mechanism of injury is the type and direction of forces necessary to cause an injury. That excludes magnitude, right? So we've talked about it a little bit, but types of forces are compression, so pushing together, tensile loading, which is pulling apart, shear loading, which is essentially sliding or transverse to a plane, torsion. Along with those different types of loading, you can have combinations of all those loading. Now, direction is important because the human body and all objects in are three-dimensional. So knowing that each one of those types of forces, as well as any combination of those forces, can be applied to the body in every plane, in any increment of that plane. That's what mechanism of injury means. That's first and foremost. If the mechanism doesn't match, then I don't need to do magnitude. And I've testified before, the analogy is if I'm looking for a red dress in size 5 and I find a blue jumpsuit, I don't care how big it is or what size it is. It doesn't matter.
All right, so to test a particular hypothesis, you're first determining if the type and direction, if the mechanism is possible.
If the mechanism is generated first, yes.
Right, and if the mechanism is generated, do you then determine whether the magnitude of the force is possible?
Again, it's if it's necessary.
If you have to get there.
If I have to get there. It depends on the case.
Are there any other potential steps in your biomechanical analysis of trying to decide if a particular hypothesis can be proved or not?
Could you please repeat that?
Sure. So in testing a particular hypothesis, you determine if the mechanism fits?
If the mechanism is generated in the hypothesis provided, yes, that I've generated based on the materials.
Right, and you then determine if you need to, if the magnitude of the force could be generated.
If necessary. Again, I'm not going to say I always have to do that, because case by case I don't need to do that.
Understood. Is there a third potential step? Or are those the two steps?
I don't know what you mean by third potential step.
All right, let's start talking. Let me go on and we'll come back to this issue. To do what you're just describing, to determine the mechanism of the injury, meaning the type and the direction of the injury, what do you have to analyze?
So I already discussed the mechanism necessary for Ms. Mullis's injuries are blunt penetrating forces, which are generated by the rake. We have that she's hyperextended, and we have the orientation the rake has to be in, because we know that the tines are flat. So it has to be somewhat entered when she's hyperextended and rotated. So that gives me a position and orientation of the rake on the surface relative to the injuries. Additionally, looking at the tines, how they are, again, fixed and almost perpendicular to the ground, just slightly downward, if you were to hold the rake up. If you match that up with her trajectories, I now have a position and orientation of how the rake fits into her wounds.
When you are conducting the type and direction analysis, are you considering the laws of physics?
Yes.
And are you considering biomechanical and engineering principles as well?
Absolutely.
All right. I want to talk about the possible hypotheses that you considered in this case. Did you consider as a possible hypothesis in this case Dr. Cruz's determination that it was possible that the corn rake was swung into Miss Mullis's body to cause these injuries?
Yes, and that was what was presented in the trial transcripts for the criminal trial, that it was swung multiple times into her body.
In your biomechanical investigation, were you able to prove or to disprove this hypothesis?
I was able to disprove that hypothesis.
And how did you disprove that hypothesis?
So again, sorry I keep saying that, but
here come the tests.
So in every analysis, the engineering fundamentals include Newton's laws of physics, conservation of energy, and I don't know if you want me to go through the laws. I don't need to go through 1, 2, and 3 unless you want me to.
Object in motion,
based on Newton's laws of physics and understanding the mechanism and the injury,
Welcome, Baker.
And
Welcome.
how the rake is positioned, yes, and in considering the anthropometrics of the people involved, there is about 10.5-inch height difference between Mr. Mullis and Ms. Mullis. So that takes that into consideration.
I want to stop you there. When you talk about their anthropometrics, was that considering the height and weight of each person that would have been involved in this hypothesis?
Yes, and later on I use it further for Ms. Mullis.
Where did you get the height and weight information that you used in your analysis?
6'2".
The medical records for Ms. Mullis provide me a height and weight. And I actually don't remember where I got Mr.
Your Honor,
Mullis.
I am going to object to the line of questioning as beyond the scope of the report in violation of the rules of civil procedure, as it does not include the study nor the actual evaluation of Ms. Mullis's weight or for any of the matters in question here. In fact, I believe that Dr. Nye's report specifically, her second report at page 2, footnote 5 says she doesn't include the actual data and principles, and to date I don't believe we've received the specific data, principles, or force inert evaluations. I'm sorry, the force evaluations at issue for her testimony here. And so the state objects, says it's beyond the scope for purposes of the rules of civil procedure, and therefore falls outside the allowable scope of her expert testimony.
You wish to respond?
I thought that we conferred about this at the break, but we tendered Dr. Nye's biomechanical investigation materials to the state in discovery. I wasn't at the case at this point, so I'll let my colleague handle this, but these materials were disclosed.
They were disclosed last year, Your Honor, and supplemental discovery, I think it was May 27th or June 4th, 2024.
All right, so who's wrong?
Clarification, Your Honor, is this what you're referencing?
Yes.
I don't know that this is actually, as we conferred in the hallway, I believe we conferred and confirmed that most of it was Dr. Bowley's figures and expressed information, that most of this, I believe, was either copy and pasted for the portions at issue, and again, it was labeled a work in progress and never made a part of the actual expert reports at issue. So based upon the actual calculations, I do believe that we do not and have never received, as Dr. Nye's footnote 5 notes, we have never received the actual information underlying the specific findings.
That's a problem.
If you want to respond, that's fine. Otherwise, we can take a quick break and go off the record so you can look further into what was actually exchanged back on that date.
The applicant and the state share a Dropbox link, and this was provided to them in the supplemental discovery, as I mentioned. There's actually 2 files, and it's not a copy of paste. It's actually Dr. Nye's work in progress of what she was doing and how she came to her analysis of, and I think it also includes like law enforcement and reports and basically her calculations and stuff.
Your Honor, I think this is this is actually, I don't think there's a dispute about what the state received. I think the dispute here seems to be about whether that's a sufficient disclosure. I think that's the issue. I don't think we dispute what was turned over.
Well, I guess I'm hearing a dispute about what was turned over. So.
And we do dispute what was turned over.
Sure.
Commissioner Vaught, you're the witness.
Sure.
Thank you. Nice. Dr. Nye, you've previously been deposed and testified in other cases, including at least 24 prior times, correct?
Yes.
Including deposition timeframes recently in the Federal District Court for the Eastern District, I believe, of Texas on an estate case. Is that fair? I believe it's called Ramirez v. Escobedo.
I know that case, yes.
And during that point in time, you also were questioned in your deposition about how you form the notes in question. Do you recall that? How do you take notes when evaluating the case record? Fair?
I don't recall that testimony specifically, and if you could just slow down a little bit, that would be very helpful.
Oh, no problem. I apologize.
He's excited.
I believe how do you take notes and prepare the documentation?
So I typically start with a case summary file where I take basically screenshots from material I'm reviewing so I can keep track of where I got what information from. And then I generate an analysis file. And that's basically specific information from the materials I reviewed against, but more condensed. And then I go through an analysis.
And so for your case review file and the information here that would be provided, those photos, for instance, you didn't...
You have to slow down, please.
These photos specifically would be taken at different times, right?
Which photos do you mean?
For instance, what's labeled TRM demonstrating rake position.
So those are not photos. Those are screenshots from a video interview of TRM.
You also included Dr. Hammer's letter, I believe, regarding Ms. Mullis and this case specifically, right?
Yes.
And
excerpts of it, yes, excerpts of it.
The analysis and information that goes forward from there, aren't your pictures, or those your paragraphs, right?
So again, continuing on, I contain excerpts from Dr. Hammer's report. Those photos are from autopsy, I think, or from Dr. Thompson's photos. And then some inspection photos of the rake.
Including Dr. Balley's reports, figures, numbers 19, 20, and 21, I believe.
I don't know what Dr. Bowley's figure 19, 20, and 21 are.
I believe they're included in the same section of the paragraph for supplemental discovery that we'd be discussing here. Would it be helpful to see? I believe it's in your binder as well.
Could you just reference the page? I just think...
They're not numbered, but...
Yes, they are.
It's the...
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Fifth from the back.
Yes.
Those aren't your figures, correct?
Those are not my figures, but I didn't need them.
Because like you said, you screenshotted the information and included it so you could refer to it later, right?
I screenshotted information. Again, it's the information for me to look back on, so I don't have to go to multiple documents.
And so this document, or your file for purposes of the analysis, is mostly reflected in footnote 5. Fair?
Well,
where you didn't include your actual specific data, right?
So from my understanding, footnote 5 I put in there because I was going to be deposed. I had a deposition date for this case and it was canceled. So I was willing to have my deposition where I could provide my details over a year ago, which I think the state canceled.
So you haven't included those details specifically?
No, because I thought I was going to testify to them.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state submits its objection again. The information is not provided for her own evaluation and by their own, Dr. Nye's own admission, was left out for purposes of the deposition at hand. And so the state objects in violation of the rules of civil procedure.
However, my report itself.
Hold on. I was told that the information was provided to you on May something.
Dropbox.
Through a Dropbox link. If you need a chance to check and see if you have it, I will provide you with that opportunity. But as of right now, the representation is being made that the materials were in fact provided. So that's where things stand. Whether or not they came directly from the doctor or not is irrelevant to me if you have them. So do you need a chance to check and see if you received them on that date?
We can certainly check and we can also confirm.
All right. Let's go off the record. Let me know, please, when you've had a chance to do that.
Thank you.
Recess. Thank you.
Judge is getting tired of this. She's taking her computer. She's going home. No, she's actually just headed back to her studio. Not studio. Office. I have a studio. Come on, we're off the record. You can't do this. You can't talk off the record. All right. Wow. I'm fidgeting with my my screwdriver because I found out today through this witness that a screwdriver, a flat blade screwdriver like this, even though it looks like it comes to a nice, nearly knife edge, is not a sharp instrument. It's considered a blunt instrument, according to this witness, which I don't know. I searched, is a flathead screwdriver considered a sharp instrument? And the first one that came up was pathology outlines, autopsy and forensics, types of injuries, sharp force injuries, sharp force injuries produced by sharp objects. Knives are most commonly used weapons. Get to the part here. Okay. Atypical sharp and pointed objects that can be used to produce sharp force injuries include, but are not limited to, scissors, screwdrivers, fragments of glass. Example, broken bottleneck or glasses, forks, ice picks, etc. So there is disagreement in the scientific community on this topic. In my opinion, the non-legally trained mind, it looks like the defense is winning, says Barb. Here's the issue. The judge is very, very smart. She's a smart cookie, right? She's the chief judge. Okay, she's not like a newbie at this. This is not her first case. She's hearing this post-conviction relief trial. Sorry, the word escaped me. Post-conviction relief trial to see if the convicted defendant, Todd Mullis, who has already gone to trial for this crime, been found guilty by a jury, been sentenced to life in prison, and appealed and lost his appeal. This is his last effort. In Iowa, they allow you to sue civilly, to sue the state and say, nope, I should get a new trial. That's what he's doing here. So Todd Mullis is the plaintiff in this civil suit. The state, who are the prosecutors, are the defendants in this suit. The burden rests on Todd Mullis's team. They have to prove that there was something that happened, maybe, improper action by the attorneys, new evidence, something like that. In this case, I think they're going with the idea that his attorneys should have said in trial, instead of saying, yes, you're right, it's clear this was a murder, they should have said, but don't you think it could have been an accident? And they didn't. They went with yep, we think it's a murder too. And so they're saying with this new evidence, which is this testimony from these experts who say, hey, it could have been an accident, that is substantial enough that it would have affected the outcome of the trial. Thus, the judge should decide in this civil suit that, in fact, Todd Mullis's team has won the point and they are entitled to a new trial. Or throw the whole thing out, throw his conviction out, he walks a free man, or reduce his sentence, or the most likely thing of all, do nothing and he goes back to jail for life, which is probably what's going to happen. This is a tough road to hoe, even if you're just using a corn rake. What's a corn rake? A corn rake, imagine a pitchfork. A pitchfork has 4 tines, okay? They go up like that. Imagine them bent over like this. Same tool, same handle, and now you use it like this, like a rake. You can stab and claw, and it's like that. It's like a large back scratcher, okay? A big back scratcher. And it was used like that, sort of, for deep scratches and penetrations. What's your professional opinion, Barb? Here's what I think. The idea that somebody fell on the rake over and over, like 3 times fell on the rake and then got up and then fell again, got up and then fell again, causing all the different angles of attack, I'm not seeing it. I haven't heard all the evidence in this trial. I didn't watch it the first time around. It seems much more likely to me that they could pursue it wasn't me, which is what they did the first time. And this is why they're not doing it at this trial, because you can't come back and say, hey, I need a new trial because it wasn't me. They need to show that there was an error. If they show there's an error and then they get a new trial, I think they should still use the it wasn't me side, because this it was an accident side is not believable to me. I could get 2 falls, but not 3. It's a lot of holes for one fall. He has all the motive. He has what I would say considerable opportunity. If the tines were up, a fall could definitely do that injury. Oh, 1, yeah. The stab that went all the way through nearly perforated her body, 6 inches deep. Yeah, it could do that. A fall would do that. But could you fall? Here's her back, right? You guys see this? Here's her back. Some of the stabs come this way, and some of them come this way. Like some go like that, and some go like this. The angle that she fell on it, she'd have to like fall and jump, leaping one direction and land on it with it at an angle, and then fall and leap the other direction and land. It's not happening. Janet says, I was on the fence during his original trial and I'm still sitting there. I think there's probably much more room for doubt in the who did it instead of did someone do it. Handle was above her head. Yes, so the handle went up this way, up tall, with the stabby thing in her back. That's the way he found her, with 2 of the prongs still in her. She was like kneeling on her hands and knees, like had fallen forward, is on her hands and knees, upright like that, not like on her side. And he moved her and took the rake out of her back. The shoved the rake in multiple times, that stuck as a possibility, specifically when we're talking about her Carhartt jacket not having as many holes as her body did. So one fast, high-force strike, whether that she falls on it or is pushed on it or it's swung and hit her, and then with it still in her back, somebody uses the spines and sort of like drives them in without pulling it all the way out of the coat again. That could be a possibility, but they'd have to have moved the handle around significantly. I really hope that this witness, starts telling us about the different tests she did. There we go, John. WWE can explain it all. Just watch the guy with the chair in the ring. Handle of the rake was shorter, several feet shorter. Yeah, it was like 36 inches long total. It's a short-handled corn rake. Some things that are not going to be brought up in this trial, but were brought up in the original one, is the victim in this trial had previously been unfaithful in the marriage. There was an affair where she was involved with someone at work. She worked at a hospital. She met somebody through the hospital and was involved with them. And then through counseling, marriage counseling, and an agreement, which sounded like Todd said, now I control you. Everything you do, you have to run through me. I'm going to watch everything and make sure this doesn't happen again. Through that sort of agreement, they decided to give it another go and keep at it. She started having another affair, though, with the pig farmer. I mean, Todd's a pig farmer, but there was the farmhand pig farmer on the farm, right there by home. And so she started having an affair there. And Todd heard rumors of that and was very upset. He was upset for a couple things. First of all, nobody wants to be cheated on. The second was he was concerned that if his marriage were to fall apart through divorce, he would lose a substantial portion of the farm, which was his baby. His pride and joy was that farm. He had grown it from its original size to now include 3.25 or something, 3.5 farms. He had bought many other farms as well, and that was his life's work, was this farm, and he didn't want to lose any of it. So to him, divorce was not an option because of what it would do to the farm. That could be motive. That could be clearly you want to get rid of her, but you don't want to lose the farm. She had told people that she was going to be leaving, that she had already, I think she had sort of ended the relationship with the pig farmhand, and was looking for the right time and place to get out and just say, I'm done with this one. Clearly, we can't work together. We can't do this together. We should probably be apart. And they had been, they were sleeping separate for months, different areas of the house. But all this just goes to motive. That doesn't mean he did it. I want to hear the evidence that he did it. I have to go back and watch the original trial. I think I'm going to go listen to the testimony from the original trial. He testified in his original trial. I want to see that. Let's see. Heard the farm was in a trust. It was worth millions and not touchable. I don't know when that happened. If I realize the trust could help that situation, but not all your asset. The farm isn't all. I mean, he probably has other assets as well that he didn't want to lose. Could the motive be he caught her cheating and was a crime of passion? I don't know. It was was quite a while after he found out about it that this happened. Did they have anything that helped him today? Sort of, but then again, sort of not. Some of the things that the witness said on the stand almost helped the state more. We're going to be back in just a moment here. The witness has not left the courtroom. She's staying right there. She's going to do her yoga next to the witness stand. Let's see. What happened to my my short? Oh, there it is. Thank you to the 333 of you who watched the first short I've ever produced. It was terrible. It was the first full trial on Trial TV Live. It's awesome. Like Chris and Aaron, they're great. The guy she was cheating on was at his house with his son. That's the alibi for him, so it couldn't have been him. Might have to play yoga music if she starts exercising. Barb, I don't see everything quite the way the Innocence Project does. I like the work they do. The idea that somebody is sitting in prison wrongfully does not sit well with me, right? And yes, it's possible that somebody who's guilty might be let out through the Innocence Project's work, but I'm more okay with that than the idea that somebody innocent is sitting locked up. P. Cooper, I released it again. It's a new one. It's the same one, but I just re-released it. Christy was at a charity event all day. She was cleared. I do have some shorts, but some of them were created for me. I haven't created all of them yet. I might go back. My wife actually said what I should do is go back, and every time we have a verdict, I should take that from the moment we punch the verdict music, make a little short of just my little synopsis of the trial and just post that. How can it be the rate? How can it be the rate cannot be pushed but fallen into? Loves Bunny Hop. I didn't buy that either. I have not used a corn rake, but I've used a pitchfork. I realize they're a little bit different. That the tines of a pitchfork are probably a little sharper than the tines of a corn rake, but a human can pretty easily. I mean, an adult can pretty easily push about 100 pounds of force, right? They can apply that much pressure, and if you have 100 pounds of force on 2 or 3 of these points, I mean, I could stab it into wood. I could push this into wood pretty easily. 4 of them might be a little harder, but wood is a lot harder than, the human body. I think it could be done. Make a short with Screaming Goat. I know where you can find a vote. Valhalla waits. I got your message, by the way. I'd love to do. Can we talk about it here? I've got Legos. I just don't have a set. Am I supposed to get a specific Lego set is it like a competition? Who can be done first? I have all these questions. Yes, and we'll have to talk goats. My herd of goats is not nearly as impressive as yours. Mine look more like this. No, we're not done for the day. We just had a break, so the defense, which is the prosecutors in the original trial, can look and see if they actually do have this material, which they've argued and said was not disclosed to them, which is a discovery violation. If it's in the Dropbox and it was provided, then let me know. I'm stoked. Valhalla awaits. I'm all in. By the way, I'm not reserving in any way my decision. Sign me up, please. It's not a competition, but typically we go till the completion of a set. It hasn't always worked that way, though. Some people have even free-built their own Lego builds. Okay. So I happen to be the proud owner of another 14 pounds of Legos. Thank you, by the way. So if I can steal them from my kids, I have plenty of Legos. But my eyes aren't good enough to follow the instructions anyway. I'll just build. You can pre-order the goat. Is there a Lego set with goats involved? Lego Goat Farm. Lego Goat Farm. Oh, there he is. There he is. I might need this. Lego Friends of the Sanctuary of the Farm Animals building 5 animals. $70. Oh, it's a lot of goats. I have to research what this needs to. I want to compete properly.
All right, close again the session. Thank you. Please be seated.
Squeaky chairs.
Okay, Mr. Duden, were you able to identify if you had received the materials that were referenced in that footnote?
My belief, Your Honor, is that we have received the materials that have been disclosed and exchanged during discovery, so there's no dispute as to what we received. I think the dispute is to whether or not it's substantively enough for purposes of an expert evaluation or report, as they're required to include their data, impressions, and opinions. We're certainly willing to wait on our objection in order to talk about that evaluation, but what it sounded like when we left off, or at least my understanding, was that based upon a deposition that had never occurred, that information was going to be left out in order to be asked about. That information was going to be able to be requested at that deposition, but was not included within the report itself. So I think more so it's whether or not the data and impressions and opinions that would be included in the report are enough. And certainly, as our objections had been noted earlier, the answer was no. But we do not believe that there's any dispute as to what's been exchanged.
Okay.
So the state withdraws its objection for the purposes of continuing questioning, and will raise the objection again should we go outside the scope of what was, believed to be included in the report itself. Just say you were wrong.
Okay. We'll continue. Dr. Nny, I would just remind you that you remain under oath. Ms. Thompson.
Your Honor, I want to proceed. I just want to say that I'm not sure that reflects our position on this issue, but I agree we should move forward. But I'd rather take this up at another time.
Okay.
Understanding I don't accept that representation, I agree that we should proceed.
All right, we will. And I will just question you. I know we did go a little bit late yesterday in order to finish with the witness. I have no idea what Dr. Nye's obligations are as far as time. And we maybe can go a few minutes past 4:30 today, but that will be it. So
we've got 15 more minutes.
I want to be candid with the court that while, this is a witness who is moving expeditiously, I do not think I'm going to be done with this witness by 4:30. I just don't see that being the case, Your Honor.
Okay, in that, right. I didn't expect that you probably would be, and obviously we have cross-examination. I was just concerned about what the doctor's schedule was more than anything. So I wanted to let you know we weren't going to be able to go late today. So.
Understood.
Okay, you may continue.
I think the question that I posed that led to this break was whether, Dr. Nye, you had an understanding of the relative weights and heights of Ms. Mullis and Mr. Mullis. And I think you provided an answer, but just because that was a few minutes ago, what is your understanding of their relative heights and weights?
My understanding is Ms. Mullis was 163-ish pounds near the time of the incident, about 5'1½", and Mr. Mullis is about 10.5 inches taller.
There was height and weight for Ms. Mullis. There was information in her medical records and in Dr. Cruz's autopsy report. Is that right?
Yes.
Were those numbers different in terms of her height or weight?
They were consistent.
All right. And the information in her medical records reflected her weight and her height when she was alive?
Yes.
Okay.
Excuse me.
And I think you started to talk about this, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page since we took a break. It was your determination that it was not possible for the hypothesis that the corn rake in this case was swung into Ms. Mullis's body to be true. Is that right?
Yes, based on my investigation, that was the corn rake was not swung into her body.
And how did you reach that determination?
So again, applying the engineering fundamentals, looking at the wound pattern externally and internally, looking at the intrinsic properties and geometry and measurements of the rake, putting them together, understanding that we know that A, B, and C wounds happen first, and their wound trajectories are about horizontal with the long axis of the body. So you match.
Let me stop you right there. What does horizontal to the long axis of the body mean?
Like perpendicular. So perpendicular, near perpendicular to the long axis of the body.
Straight in.
That's the wound paths for A, B, C, and D. So if you match up the tines, which have a very fixed position and geometry, now I have a relative position of the rake handle has to be essentially along the long axis of her body. The rake handle is along her body. Essentially, like her buttocks would be contacting the handle upon entry for A, B, and C to occur. So then, understanding that, you look at the swing options. Aside from the multiple swing option, let's look at the first swing option. And a swinging of the rake, overhead swinging of the rake, would generate much steeper angles of wound trajectory and did not match the physical evidence.
I want to show you I'm going to show you a demonstrative that we've identified as figure E. Let me just tell the state what this is. This is
hear you whispering, but I can't quite hear what you said. All right, there we go. Not sure what we decided, but we decided.
Looking at some demonstrative exhibits assist you in your testimony in describing how you considered the hypothesis of whether Mr. Mullis swung this rake into Ms. Mullis's body?
Yes, how I can demonstrate how I analyzed it, yes.
Okay. You're looking at I think there should be a figure on the screen in front of you, which is we've identified as figure E. Would using figure E help you illustrate your testimony?
Yes.
All right, and can you explain how you determined that swinging an overhead swing would not have, is not a hypothesis that works in terms of how Ms. Mullis received these injuries?
Yes, so what this entails is the figure that demonstrates the wound trajectories for all A to F wounds, and that A, B, C, and D are essentially, like we talked about, perpendicular to the long axis of the body. In an overhead swing, based on the properties of the rake, when you try to swing it into a person, you're creating much steeper angles. So therefore, the type and direction of forces that are necessary to cause Ms. Mullis's diagnosed wound pattern isn't generated from the swing.
I want the details on that, though.
So
why?
There are different angles at which, depending on the distance of two people, in terms of where they're standing vis-a-vis each other, there's different angles that could be generated by an overhead swing depending on the distance between the two people. Is that right?
So if you want to generate the maximum speed, you mean, then you have to be farther apart?
Well, my question is just that if, for instance, if in this situation, in this scenario where you're assuming people of the relative heights of Ms. Mullis and Mr. Mullis, if you're considering a hypothesis of whether someone standing behind Ms. Mullis and swinging the rake overhead, how that would contact Ms. Mullis's back. Yes. Depending on the distance between the two people, that angle might be different. Is that right? The angle at which the rake hit Ms. Mullis's back.
So you want the rake tines to hit. So that you're not talking about the other parts of the rake.
Let me ask you a better question.
Okay.
That would be good.
Would the distance between two people in a hypothetical where a person is standing and then a person is standing behind them swinging a rake overhead, would the distance between the two people impact the rake, the angle at which the rake tines hit their back?
Yes.
Well, if you have them closer, the rake tines might not even hit their back at all.
And why is that?
Because of the, again, intrinsic properties of the rake. It has a specific length, has a specific entry point if you want the tines to be in there. So they have to be positioned and oriented in such a way that the rake tines enter her body while she's hyperextended.
And is there, could you envision in testing this hypothesis any sort of position where a person could have been standing behind Ms. Mullis and swinging the rake overhead where the specific injuries with the specific pattern and trajectory that Ms. Mullis's injuries had could have resulted?
No. We tested standing upright, various angles of bending over, lying flat on the ground. The way the rake tine is built and her nature of her injuries, and knowing that she has to be hyperextended at the time the tines enter to cause A, B, and C, the angles don't match. The position and orientation doesn't match. Therefore, the mechanisms, the type and direction of forces necessary to cause those specific diagnosed wounds don't match.
I'm going to show you figure F.
Handle's about 3 feet. I haven't heard how they think this happened.
Let me have you take the demonstrative away, and let me ask you a different question. I mean, you've talked about the rake being, the hypothetical that the rake was swung overhead. There's other ways that a rake could be swung into a person's back, is that right?
Yes.
I mean, another way would be through more of a baseball swing?
Yes, a lateral
sideways?
Swing. Yes, a sideways swing.
A lateral swing. Did you consider that hypothesis as well?
Yes.
And could you prove or disprove that hypothesis?
Yes.
Which did you do?
Disproved it.
And why is that?
Again, based on the intrinsic properties of the rake and the injury pattern. If you're going to swing it sideways into the body, you would have a more vertical oriented wound pattern. That's in line. That's not what she has. Additionally, the wound paths through her body wouldn't match. So, the mechanism of injury necessary to cause her diagnosed wound paths aren't generated with a lateral swing.
You talked earlier about your understanding in this case based on the medical diagnoses that Ms. Mullis's back would have been hyperextended at the time that she experienced these wounds.
So biomechanically, that is true as well.
Right, and would the fact that her back was hyperextended, and to hyperextend her back, that her arm, at least her right arm, would have had to have been back, did that impact your analysis as to whether any kind of swinging could have caused these injuries?
I mean, the arm could get in the way, again, as well. So if you're talking about position and orientation, in order to get that A wound, which is on the side of the chest, with your arm, if you're trying to swing it, the arm is in the way, essentially.
What about a hypothetical where instead of, in a hypothetical, somebody of Mr. Mullis's size standing behind Ms. Mullis, they're facing each other at the time in this hypothetical that the rake is swung. Did you consider that hypothetical?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion about the possibility of that hypothetical?
It was that hypothesis is disproven.
And why is that?
Because, again, of the wound paths and the rake, if you swing overhead, you're going to have upward trajectories. And then we already know that ENF can't be generated first because it's essentially in the middle of their back. You can't have two tines entering in the middle of her back without a third tine contacting. And we only have two wounds that are upward trajectories.
If someone had swung the rake into Ms. Mullis into wounds E and F, would there have to be other wounds in that same trajectory?
You'd have a third tine sometime would have to contact it because of the location of the wounds and the spacing between the tines.
So I think we've shown you well, I want to ask you this. I mean, is it possible for somebody to have swung the rake into any of these wounds, wounds A through F, and had one tine make contact with her body, and all of the other tines missing her body?
So again, we talked about how the wounds are essentially in the middle of her back. The nature and diagnosis of her wounds and the intrinsic properties of the rake, you cannot insert one tine at a time.
Does the condition of Ms. Mullis's coat that she was wearing at the time she came to the hospital, does that factor into your opinion that the rake could not have been swung into Ms. Mullis?
It supports it.
How's that?
Well, again, she has 6 holes in her body, and there's 4 tines in the rake, and there's less holes in the coat than there are in the body. So if you swing it, even though we've proven that the trajectory doesn't match with any kind of swinging that we've talked about, if you take that rake out and re-swing it, you still have less holes in the coat than you do in the body, so that doesn't matter. So that's, again, further support that a swinging incident did not cause these injuries.
Given your training and expertise in biomechanical engineering and the investigation that you conducted in this case, Dr. Nny, can you think of any position that Ms. Mullis and a hypothetical assailant of Mr. Mullis's height could be in vis-a-vis each other? Any position that they could be in relative to each other where, from an engineering perspective, it would be possible for someone to cause this wound pattern in Ms. Mullis's back from swinging this corn rake into her?
So I analyzed the information that's available. There's no, information that there's a trapeze available. I can't analyze every single 1,000,010
trapeze,
possibilities. Those are all unlikely. I have to take into consideration the evidence in the case. And engineering analyses, like we talked about, don't take 2 seconds to do. Right? So my analyses are based on the information that's provided and the scenarios that are provided. But from my analysis of the case, given what I have, there was not an alternative scenario that fit the physical evidence and the science.
So we have a swinging trapeze.
Did you consider the hypothesis that someone pushed Miss Mullis down on the rake?
Yes.
And did you determine whether or not that hypothesis was possible?
I considered it, but I considered it.
And could you prove or disprove that hypothesis in your consideration?
I disproved it.
And why is that?
So when you push someone, you are imparting horizontal velocity as well as rotational acceleration to their body. So when you push someone, they're going to essentially rotate, kind of flip. And if this rake we talked about is top heavy. So if you're falling on the rake with horizontal and rotational acceleration of your body with your upper body and you hit the rake tips, you're going to flip this rake. And if you flip the rake, then you don't have the rake tines pointing up in the manner to cause the injuries.
And when you talk about it generating horizontal force, if someone is standing in front of me and shoves me, hypothetically, 2 hands into my 2 shoulders, that horizontal force, where is that going to send my body?
It's going to send you backwards and rotate because a person standing upright, their center of mass is about 55% of their standing height, so about navel. So we're already slightly top heavy, generally speaking. So now if you push someone above their center of mass, now you're going to move them backwards and rotate them. So basically you're going to flip them with their feet coming up, in a sense.
Your Honor, I think I probably have maybe another 20, 25 minutes. I think this might be a good time to stop for the day, and we will endeavor tomorrow to finish promptly.
Sure. No, that's fine. Thank you for letting me know this is a good time for a break. We'll go ahead and recess for the night. Counsel, maybe if you just check in with me back in chambers before you take off. I'll plan on seeing everyone back tomorrow. Thank you.
All right. With that, we're done with the questions. I don't know how we have 40 people on the witness list. We must be nearly to the point where we start just asking one question per witness. I don't know how we're going to get done this week, but that's the plan. Unless somebody's heard differently. Newton's law of force. For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. Yeah, physics. Yes, it's good stuff. If she can fall, she can be pushed. Man. For those that are asking, yes, I did file a police report. I'll tell you the story, just the quick version. And it happened right around lunchtime. I'm sitting here live streaming. I hear people like talking and shouting and stuff outside. And I see people moving right outside my window. So like 10 feet away from me. And I go out to find the local community water crew, like the maintenance guys, in my yard. And a guy in my basement has gone in through the cellar access. And he opened the door to get in my basement. I have a problem with this. I'm asking what you're doing on my property. And they're like, oh, we're just trying to see where this water was coming from. And I'm like, well, you can see it was coming from the pipe out by the road because that's where the sump drains. So still, why are you in my house? Well, we just seen if there was a leak or something else. Well, you can see if there's a leak by looking at my water meter. And if it's not spinning, there's no leak. I'm like, we just need to see where this was. And turns out they were out there trying to find where the water was out on the street. There's water because I live in North Carolina and the water table is about, that deep. And so my basement is below the water table. So my sump pumps out water. If it is not a drought, my sump is going to be pumping periodically to drain the lowest point, which is in a hole outside my house. We had a lot of snow that froze and melted, and that's raised the water table, and so it's pumping. And occasionally my sump gets stuck and doesn't engage when it should, and the water gets a little deeper, and then it takes a while. And so it was dry outside, and then the sump engages and spits water out. They didn't ask me to go in my basement, okay? They didn't ring my doorbell. And as a matter of fact, they were out in front of the neighbor's house somewhere down the road looking at this, where the water runs all the way down to the ditch. And somebody came out and was like, hey, what are you guys doing? And they told him, and he sort of traced it back to my house. So it was the neighbor. It was actually the brother of a neighbor who lives down the road who went in my house and opened my door. I was so upset. I called the city twice. They called me twice. Once to tell me that they no longer accept Discover, and I need to pay my bill. So now I have to update that today, or else they'll shut my water off. Like I have to pay by Friday, I think. But I was frustrated, so I called the police, and I said I'd like to file a report. And actually, when they called me to tell me that they don't accept Discover for auto paying my bill anymore, I think that might be Mrs. R.A. She might be home. I think it's time. Anyway, when they called to tell me that, I'm like, okay, I'll update it. Thanks. By the way, can you transfer me to the police department because I need to file a complaint against your water guys? And I did. Anyway, the cop showed up, filed the report. I just let him know, hey, I'm really frustrated. I want you guys to have this on record, so in case somebody does show up in my house and I accidentally, fill his prescription, his lead prescription for the day, you know why? And they're like, yeah, do it. So don't show up at my house and try to come in. I will do bad things to you with under proper authority. All right. Hey, who's here? You're back. How was swimming? Where did you go? Do you remember? Williamsburg.
We went to 2 other historical places as well.
Jamestown. Something else. Okay, we have a scam caller. They know it's time. Hang on. Hello? Hello? They hang up. Yeah, it's Mrs. R.A. She's coming in. Yes, I was going to fill the lead prescription. We'll cover your trial. There will be no trial. The police will be like, yeah, justified. I told him. I said that's a quick way to get perforated. I mean, if you, I have a semi-automatic hole puncher just for this very reason. And if somebody is seeking perforation, try coming to my house. Anyway, I already told her that when I turned to the camera like this earlier today, I was on the phone with her and I was telling her. But I want to see Mrs. She's mad too. She's pretty mad. What was the brother's age? Probably 50. Knows better. Old enough to know better. Did they apologize? No. The water guys are like, yeah. First, I thought all 3 of them were water guys. I didn't know one of them was a neighbor. I don't know him. I've never seen him before. And they're like, the water guys, apparently when it was done, they called their boss and like, hey, we were doing this and some neighbor guy went in this guy's house. It was really weird. It's like, yeah, it was. But you told him what you were doing and you walked over there with him and you stood there and watched. I don't think you guys are just like, it wasn't our fault. We didn't do it. So anyway. So we're going to change one of the motion sensors down there because there's currently motion sensors and move a camera. And so help me. You don't want to be caught on that camera. I texted offline to make sure it was okay and didn't need reinforcements. No, it was close though. Anyway, I was super frustrated. My home, my castle, I live here, my kids live here. This is not the place for a meet and greet. Amber, you're the exception. But, yeah, that's it. Show your neighbor the corn rake. I'll text them, right? That's what we learned from the goat trail midday. All right. Hey, so glad to see you. How was the drive?
Good. It was good.
You get any speeding tickets?
Almost, but I had a phone that was like, what cop is up ahead?
You almost did? The phone warned you?
Yeah.
How fast were you going?
I don't know, but I stopped going that fast before.
But it was faster than you were supposed to. Okay, we're not going to admit anything because statute of limitations and all. All right, we are just wrapping up for the day. Tomorrow, I guess we're back on this. I don't know how. I was on a Google. I Googled something. It was something you guys asked me to Google. I Googled something, and that led me on. I'm currently searching for ground-penetrating radar for sale, used. And I don't know how I got there, so I'll have to chase my history back. I'm pretty sure I started looking for something about stabbing and how much force is needed to stab someone. And I ended up with this. So tomorrow it looks like we're going to start about the same time, about 10 o'clock Eastern time, which is 9 o'clock local in Iowa. Court is done for the day. Valhalla awaits. I'm not sure. Can I announce this? Can I announce the date? A Lego live stream build. I don't know how this is going to go. Yes, okay. March 8th. Was that right? If I remember correctly. March 8th, which I think is it a Saturday? It's like a Friday or Saturday night. Whatever March 8th is. We'll do a live stream where I'm going to learn how to use Legos. And it's a race or something. I was looking for those as well. So, yes, Saturday the 8th. All right. At 9 p.m. Eastern. So we can put it on your calendar. I am so excited. I have to watch other people now to just make sure I do this right. But I'm excited to do this. We have tons of Legos, but I want to have a complete set. So you did look up Unalive with Cornrick. I did. That was in my search history today. I'll go ahead and clear that out. I'm pretty sure once you delete it, it's gone forever, right? Might have been screwdriver research. It was. I've been fidgeting with this all day, so much that I had to move my phone in case I accidentally stabbed something. Tell Mrs. R.A. I sent my love. My son's playing the piano. It's way better than this house protected by a blah, blah security sign. We have the security system as well. But we know if the security system for some reason fails, when all else fails, perforate. Definitely do more Google searches also. Something about how to make a peanut butter sandwich and, something innocuous like that. This could get spicy as a Recovery Addict after bedtime. Yeah, that's after 9 p.m. It could be wild. It could be pretty wild. Yes, they went to Yorktown. Historic Jamestown, and Williamsburg. They did a 2-day trip with a homeschool special. So I can't wait to hear about it. I'm hoping they took a couple pictures. I have not been to Yorktown or historic Jamestown. So it was awesome. I've been to Williamsburg a few times. Delete does not equal delete. This is Karen. I might have to wipe this computer and then have purge my Google history on the Google server. Oh. All right, there we go. It's been a fun day. I can't wait to talk to my family that I haven't seen for 2 days, so I'm going to let you guys go. It's dinner time anyway. It's time. Everyone should go home. Everyone should have some food. Take a break. We're going to try again tomorrow. Tonight when you go home, please hug the people you love. Smile at someone, make their day just a little bit better, and please stay safe. We go live again tomorrow morning about, it's going to be between 9 and 10, so probably 9:30 Eastern. Maybe 9. I think, yes. We've got another hearing to watch Thursday. So we have the one after the goat hearing that we might want to watch. I'll pre-watch that, make sure it's good, and we'll do that in the morning, so we might start a little bit earlier. All right? Does that sound fair? Did neighbor assume you were out of town with your wife? No! He knew we were here. Anyway. Y'all have a good night. We'll see you on the flip side. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. You're my new best friend.